Hey guys, tonight we step into a frozen world where your breath crystallizes before it leaves your lips, where the Rocky Mountains transform into a white cathedral of death, and where the only thing standing between you and eternity is your own stubborn refusal to die. It's the winter of 1836, and you're a mountain man, a trapper, a wanderer, a fool in buckskin who thought wrestling grizzlies and dodging Blackfoot arrows was the hard part. You probably won't survive this. Statistically speaking, you really shouldn't. The winter bearing down on you will kill more trappers than any Native American conflict, more than any disease outbreak, more than all the bear attacks and river drownings combined. And yet, here you are, smelling like beaver musk and bad decisions, about to find out exactly what you're made of. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how this strange little bedtime community stretches across the globe. Someone's falling asleep in Tokyo while someone else is just getting cozy in Toronto. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The summer rendezvous at Horse Creek has been everything you needed it to be, and absolutely nothing you needed it to be. You stand in the aftermath of what mountain men call civilization, a temporary explosion of commerce, alcohol, and questionable life choices that erupts once a year when trappers descend from their lonely territories to trade beaver pelts for supplies. The Green River Valley stretches around you, still littered with the debris of nearly 500 trappers, traders, and indigenous peoples who've spent the past 2 weeks engaged in what can only be described as frontier capitalism meets fraternity party. You've traded well, or at least you think you have. Your pack contains new steel traps to replace the ones that rusted beyond salvation. You've got powder and lead for your hawk and rifle, a few twists of tobacco that you'll ration like gold dust, and a woolen blanket that the American Fur Company representative swore was worth the 12 prime beaver pelts you surrendered for it. Historians still argue whether the mountain men were exploited by the fur companies, or whether they were willing participants in their own economic marginalization. But standing here with your new blanket and empty pockets, you're not particularly interested in academic debates. You're thinking about the winter ahead. The rendezvous of 1836 carries a strange energy that you can't quite name. The beaver trade is dying, though most trappers refuse to admit it. Silk hats are becoming fashionable back east and in Europe, which means beaver felt is slowly going the way of powdered wigs. The great fur companies are already pivoting toward buffalo robes, though the mountain men, creatures of habit and stubbornness, keep setting their traps in the same streams their father's generation discovered. You've heard rumours that some trappers are talking about heading to California, or maybe Oregon, places where a man might actually own land instead of just bleeding on it. But that's future thinking, and future thinking is a luxury you can't afford right now. The present demands your attention because the present contains something troubling. The old-timers are acting strange. You watch Jim Bridger, old Gabe himself, squint at the western sky with an expression that makes your stomach tighten. Bridger is 32 years old, which in mountain man years makes him roughly ancient. He's been trapping these mountains since he was 18, and if anyone can read the weather like scripture, it's him. He's saying nothing, which is somehow worse than if he were making dire predictions. The man who usually can't shut up about his adventures is standing there with his lips pressed together like he's trying to keep something terrible from escaping his mouth. The Shoshone traders are leaving earlier than usual. You notice this because the Shoshone usually linger, happy to continue bartering and visiting with the white trappers who've married into their bands. But this year they're packing up with a quiet urgency that speaks louder than any warning. When you ask one of the older Shoshone men why the rush, he looks at you with something that might be pity, and says something in his language that your limited vocabulary can't pass. Your trapper friend who speaks better, Shoshone, translates, "He says the elk told him to leave." You almost laugh, but something stops you. Out here, you've learned that laughing at indigenous weather predictions is the kind of arrogance that gets men killed. These people have survived in this landscape for thousands of years, while European colonizers have barely managed a few decades. If the Shoshone say the elk are nervous, you should probably be nervous too. The rendezvous breaks apart like a dropped mirror, fragments scattering in every direction. Some trappers head north toward Blackfoot country, where the beaver are plentiful and the death rate is correspondingly high. Others turn south toward Taos, hoping to trap the smaller streams of the southern Rockies. A few, the smart ones you're beginning to suspect, announce they're done with the mountains entirely and point their horses east towards St. Louis and whatever remains of normal society. You're heading toward your usual wintering territory, a network of valleys and streams near the Wind River Range that you've come to know like the creases in your own palm. It's good country. The valleys provide shelter from the worst winds, the streams hold beaver, and you've established relationships with the eastern Shoshone bands who winter nearby. At least it's been good country in normal years. But something tells you, something in the quality of the light, something in the way your horse keeps twitching her ears, that this year might not be normal. You ride west with 3 companions, a French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste, who's been in these mountains longer than anyone can remember, a young greenhorn from Kentucky named Thomas, who still flinches every time his rifle discharges, and a half-crow, half-Scottish trapper everyone calls MacDonald, who never explains which parent contributed which heritage. It's a good group, small enough to move fast and share supplies without constantly calculating who's eating more than their share. Large enough that you can keep watch rotations without anyone dying of exhaustion. The first week of travel feels almost normal. The September sun remains warm enough that you can pretend summer hasn't ended, even as the aspens begin their slow transformation into gold. You make good time through terrain you know well, fording rivers at established crossings and camping in meadows where you've camped before. Baptiste tells stories in his thick accent about winters past, some of them probably even true, and Thomas asks endless questions about trapping techniques that Baptiste answers with decreasing patience. MacDonald rides in silence, as always, his eyes scanning the tree line with an intensity that you've learned to trust. But small things start to accumulate. Wrong things. The birds are behaving strangely, moving in patterns you don't recognise. You spot a herd of elk moving south, not unusual for September, but they're moving fast, almost running, as if something is chasing them that you can't see. When you stop to water the horses at a stream you've used dozens of times, you notice the beaver dam is different. Taller. Much taller. The beavers have added several feet of height to their construction, creating a dam that looks almost paranoid in its over-engineering. "That's bad," Baptiste says, staring at the dam. He doesn't elaborate, and you don't ask him to. You've been in the mountains long enough to know what it means when beavers build high. They're preparing for something. They know something you don't, operating on instincts refined over millions of years of evolution that your species abandoned when you decided to invent whiskey and regret. That night, sitting around a fire that crackles with false cheerfulness, you stare at the sky and try to read it the way Bridger reads it, the way the Shoshone read it, the way every creature in these mountains seems to read it except you. The stars look the same as always, cold, distant, indifferent to your survival. But there's something in the air itself, a weight, or a charge, that makes the hair on your arm stand up in a way that has nothing to do with the cooling temperature. "Big winter comin'," MacDonald says. It's the first words he's spoken in 2 days, and they land in the silence like stones dropped into still water. Thomas laughs nervously. "How can you tell?" MacDonald doesn't answer. He just pulls his blanket tighter around his shoulders and stares into the fire with an expression that suggests he's seeing something in those flames that the rest of you can't perceive. You think about turning back. The thought surfaces in your mind like a fish briefly breaking the surface of a lake, there and gone before you can fully examine it. Turn back to what? The rendezvous is over. St. Louis is 2,000 miles east through territory that becomes increasingly hostile as autumn deepens. Your entire identity, your entire economy is built around spending winters in these mountains, trapping beaver through ice-covered streams and emerging in spring with enough pelts to purchase another year of supplies and another chance at this strange, lonely, magnificent life. You're committed. The mountains have you now, and they're not letting go until spring, if spring ever comes for you at all. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, utterly unconcerned with the drama unfolding beneath them. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howls, and the sound carries a mournful quality that you've never noticed before. Your horse shifts uneasily, and you realize she knows something too. Every living thing in these mountains is preparing for what's coming, and you're doing your best to prepare alongside them. Even though you're operating with the evolutionary disadvantage of being human, a species that's only survived this long through stubbornness and the invention of fire. You pull your blanket, your expensive 12 beaver pelt blanket, tighter around your shoulders and try to convince yourself that you're ready. But deep in the honest part of your brain, the part that can't be fooled by bravado and whiskey, you know the truth. You have no idea what's coming, and that ignorance might be the only thing allowing you to sleep tonight. The days grow shorter with a swiftness that feels almost personal, as if the sun itself has decided to abandon you ahead of schedule. You've been in the mountains long enough to understand the rhythm of autumn, the gradual cooling, the slow retreat of daylight, the incremental preparation for winter's inevitable arrival. But this September moves differently. The calendar says you should have several more weeks of reasonable weather, yet the world around you seems to be operating on an accelerated timeline that no one consulted you about. You're learning to read the signs, or rather, you're learning that the signs have always been there, and you've simply been too arrogant or too ignorant to notice them. The indigenous peoples of these mountains have understood these warnings for generations, passing knowledge from grandparent to grandchild in an unbroken chain of survival wisdom. You, by contrast, arrived in these mountains with the accumulated knowledge of European civilization and the profound disadvantage of believing that made you smart. The elk are your first and most obvious teachers. You've hunted these magnificent animals for years, learned their migration patterns, understood their seasonal rhythms with the intimacy of a predator who depends on them for survival. Elk move south in autumn. Everyone knows this. But they don't normally move this early, and they don't normally move this fast. You spot a herd of several hundred crossing a high meadow in early September, flowing over the grass like a brown river with an urgency that makes you stop your horse and simply watch. Baptiste rides up beside you, his weathered face arranged in an expression you've come to recognize as concern disguised as neutrality. In 1812, he says quietly, the elk moved like this. That winter, I lost 3 toes and 2 friends. You file this information away in the growing catalogue of worrying observations that you're maintaining in your head. The elk know something. The question is whether you're smart enough to listen. The beaver provide your next lesson, and it's one that hits particularly close to home since beaver are, quite literally, your business. You've trapped these animals for years, learned to read their dams and lodges with professional precision. A beaver dam tells you everything you need to know about a beaver population, their numbers, their health, their productivity. You've developed an almost affectionate relationship with these industrious rodents, even as you systematically harvest them for their valuable pelts. But the dams you're encountering now are different. They're fortified in ways you've never seen, built up with extra layers of mud and branches that suggest the beavers are preparing for something catastrophic. When you stop to examine one particularly impressive construction, a dam that rises nearly 8 feet above the water level, far exceeding any reasonable engineering requirement, you notice that the beavers have also expanded their food cache dramatically. They've sunk enough branches into the mud near their lodge to feed a colony twice their size for a winter, twice as long as normal. Historians still argue whether animals possess genuine predictive abilities, or whether they simply respond to environmental cues that humans are too oblivious to detect. Standing here looking at this dam, the academic distinction seems irrelevant. Whether the beavers are reading the future or simply reacting to present conditions that your senses can't perceive, the message is the same. Prepare for the worst winter of your life. The birds provide your third warning, and it's perhaps the most unsettling because birds have always seemed so frivolous to you. Decorative elements of the mountain landscape rather than serious sources of information. You've never paid much attention to their comings and goings beyond the practical consideration of whether they might make an acceptable meal in an emergency. But now you notice that they're leaving, not just migrating. Birds migrate every year, but evacuating with a panicked haste that transforms their departure from natural rhythm into apparent route. The geese go first, their V formations appearing in the sky weeks earlier than usual, honking warnings that sound almost desperate to your newly attentive ears. Then the smaller birds follow, species you can't name flooding southward in numbers that darken the sky like living storms. Even the ravens, those hardy creatures that typically winter in the mountains alongside you, seem restless and uncertain. You watch a group of them circling a meadow with agitated caws, unable to decide whether to stay or flee, and you sympathise with their confusion more than you'd like to admit. Your horse provides the 4th warning, and this one you take most seriously because your horse is, in many ways, your most essential survival tool. She's a sturdy mountain-bred mare named Patience, an ironic name you gave her after she nearly bucked you off a cliff in your first week of partnership. Over the years, Patience has proven herself reliable in ways that human companions often fail to match. She's carried you through blizzards and across rivers, and away from grizzly bears with a steady competence that you've come to depend on absolutely. And now Patience is acting strange. She's nervous in ways you can't explain, starting at shadows and whinnying at nothing. When you make camp at night, she refuses to graze in open meadows, instead pressing close to the tree line as if seeking shelter from a threat she can sense but you cannot see. Her coat is coming in thicker than you've ever observed, a heavy winter growth that seems almost desperate in its density. When you run your hand along her flank, you feel fur like a beaver pelt, insulation far exceeding what a normal autumn would require. "The animals know," MacDonald says one evening, watching Patience nervously pace the perimeter of your camp. "They always know. We just forgot how to listen." You want to ask MacDonald how you can relearn this lost language, how you can tune your senses to the frequencies that every other creature in these mountains seems to naturally perceive. But MacDonald has already retreated into one of his characteristic silences, and you're left alone with your inadequacy. The indigenous peoples you encounter as you travel provide your final and most explicit warning. You meet a small band of crow hunters near a river crossing, their faces painted for the hunt, but their eyes carrying something that looks like worry. Through a combination of sign language and the limited crow vocabulary you've accumulated over your years in the mountains, you learn that their medicine man has been having troubling dreams, visions of a winter so severe that it swallows the mountains whole and spits out only bones in the spring. You're tempted to dismiss this as superstition, the kind of primitive mysticism that your European education taught you to view with condescending skepticism. But you've been in these mountains long enough to know better. The crow have survived in this landscape for countless generations, and their medicine men have developed methods of environmental prediction that deserve respect even if you don't fully understand them. When a medicine man says a bad winter is coming, you listen. The crow share something else with you, a piece of practical advice that will prove more valuable than any mystical prophecy. They tell you about a technique for reading snow clouds, a method of examining the western sky that can predict snowfall several days in advance. The technique involves observing the specific quality of light at sunset, the way clouds stack and layer over the distant peaks, the subtle gradations of colour that indicate different types of precipitation. You listen carefully, trying to absorb information that crow children probably learn before they can walk. By the end of September, you've assembled a catalogue of warnings so comprehensive that denial becomes impossible. The elk are moving, the beaver are building, the birds are fleeing, the horses are nervous, the indigenous peoples are worried. Every living thing in these mountains is preparing for catastrophe, and you're finally ready to prepare alongside them. But preparation requires information, and you're still operating with frustrating uncertainty about what exactly you're preparing for. A bad winter, certainly, but how bad? A cold winter, obviously, but how cold? A long winter, probably, but how long? The animals and the medicine men can tell you that danger is approaching, but they can't give you the specific data you need to make optimal decisions. So you start making your own observations, applying whatever fragments of meteorological knowledge your scattered education has provided. You watch the western sky at sunset, trying to read the clouds the way the crow taught you. You pay attention to the wind, noting shifts in direction and intensity that might indicate approaching weather systems. You observe the way ice forms on still water, the way frost patterns develop on grass, the way the air itself seems to thicken and weight itself down as temperatures drop. Most of your observations are probably useless, the fumbling attempts of an amateur trying to decode a language he barely speaks. But some of them prove valuable, confirming what the animals have already told you. The clouds are stacking wrong, the wind is shifting early, the cold is arriving with an aggressive haste that feels almost malicious. By early October the first snow falls, and it falls with a finality that erases any remaining doubt. This isn't the gentle autumn snow that usually dusts the mountains before retreating, leaving time for one last gasp of warm weather. This is winter snow, heavy and committed, laying down a white foundation that you suspect won't melt until spring, if spring comes at all. You stand in that first snowfall, flakes melting on your upturned face, and you finally accept the truth that every creature in these mountains has been trying to tell you. The winter of 1836 is going to be different. It's going to be worse than anything you've experienced, worse than anything the old-timers remember, worse than any winter in the stories that trappers tell around campfires to frighten greenhorns, and you're going to have to survive it. The snow keeps falling, soft and relentless, covering the tracks of the elk as they flee south, burying the beaver dams beneath white blankets, erasing the evidence of a world that existed before winter decided to arrive early and stay late. You have maybe 2 weeks to finish your preparations, maybe less. The mountains are waiting to see what you'll do next. The question of where to spend the winter suddenly transforms from casual consideration to urgent crisis. You've wintered in these mountains before, you know the general principles, the broad strokes of location selection that separate survivors from corpses. But this winter demands more than general principles. This winter requires perfection, or something close enough to perfection that the difference becomes merely academic. You gather your small brigade around a fire that feels inadequate against the October chill and lay out the options with the gravity of a general planning a military campaign. Because that's what this is, you realise. A war against weather, a siege that will last months instead of weeks. A battle where the enemy has unlimited resources and infinite patience, while you have only your wits and whatever supplies you can scrape together in the rapidly diminishing time remaining. Baptiste speaks first, his experience carrying weight that even his thick accent can't diminish. He advocates for the valley you've used before, a sheltered depression near the headwaters of the Wind River, where the mountains form a natural windbreak and the stream rarely freezes completely solid. It's proven territory, known and mapped in your collective memory. You know where to find water, where to hunt, where the snow accumulates, and where it stays shallow enough for travel. The familiarity is seductive, but MacDonald raises concerns that you can't dismiss. Known places become death traps, he says in his quiet way. Other trappers know that valley too. If everyone retreats to the same familiar spots, we'll strip the game bare before January. We'll starve together instead of surviving apart. This is the cruel mathematics of survival that every mountain man must eventually confront. In good years, the mountains provide enough for everyone. Enough beaver, enough elk, enough shelter and water and firewood to support a scattered population of trappers who rarely encounter each other except at the annual rendezvous. But in desperate years, the equation changes. Resources that seemed abundant become scarce, and the same familiar valleys that offered comfort in easier times transform into overcrowded death traps, where starving men compete for dwindling supplies. Thomas, the greenhorn, suggests heading south toward milder territory, and you have to suppress a flash of irritation at his ignorance. South means Ute country, complex tribal politics, unfamiliar terrain that you'd be learning during the worst possible conditions. South means abandoning everything you've spent years figuring out about this specific landscape. The knowledge of every stream and ridge and game trail that might mean the difference between finding food and finding starvation. You can't learn a new country in the middle of a killing winter. You think about the factors that should guide your decision, running through them like a catechism learned from hard experience. Shelter from wind, absolutely essential, since wind chill can transform survivable cold into killing cold faster than anything except falling through ice. Access to water that won't freeze solid, critical, because melting snow for drinking water consumes fuel you can't afford to waste. Proximity to game, necessary but complicated by the awareness that other trappers will be making similar calculations. Distance from hostile territory, important, because while you'll be fighting weather all winter, you'd prefer not to also fight Blackfoot raiders. The landscape offers options, but each option carries trade-offs that you're not entirely equipped to evaluate. Higher elevations provide certain advantages, fewer mosquitoes in summer obviously, but also often lighter snowfall since the extreme cold at altitude produces a drier, more powdery snow. But higher elevations also mean harsher temperatures, thinner air, and greater distance from the valleys where game tends to congregate during winter. Lower elevations offer warmer temperatures and better access to resources, but they also attract more competition, both human and animal. The valleys fill up with elk and deer seeking refuge from the high country, but they also fill up with wolves and mountain lions and bears seeking the same prey. And they fill up with other trappers, men whose desperation might make them dangerous as winter progresses. Historians still argue whether mountain men chose their wintering spots, through sophisticated environmental analysis, or simply through dumb luck and stubborn habit. Standing here trying to make this decision, you suspect the answer is both, a combination of accumulated wisdom and pure gambling that somehow produced enough survivors to perpetuate the profession. You eventually reach a compromise that satisfies no one completely, but bothers everyone equally, which Baptiste assures you is the hallmark of all good group decisions. You'll head toward your familiar valley, but approach it from an unconventional direction, scouting for alternative sites along the way. If the valley looks overcrowded or overhunted, you'll retreat to one of the backup locations you identified during the approach. If the valley seems viable, you'll establish your main camp there but prepare escape routes and secondary positions in case conditions deteriorate. The plan requires flexibility you're not sure you possess, and contingency thinking that conflicts with your natural inclination towards stubbornness. But survival demands adaptation, and you're beginning to understand that the mental flexibility required for this winter might prove more important than any physical preparation. You break camp and begin moving toward your chosen territory, riding through a landscape that transforms daily under the accumulating snow. The world simplifies in winter, complex autumn colours fading into a binary palette of white ground and dark trees. There's a strange beauty in this simplification, a minimalist aesthetic that strips away distraction and forces attention on essentials. But there's also terror in it, the terror of uniformity, of a landscape that erases the landmarks you depend on for navigation and survival. The journey takes longer than you anticipated, partly because of worsening weather, and partly because you're scouting with unusual care. Evaluating every potential campsite with the paranoid thoroughness of someone who understands that bad decisions made now will kill you later. You find yourself looking at familiar terrain with new eyes, noticing features you've never considered important before. This ridge would block the worst northwest winds, but would also trap snow in its lee, creating drifts that might bury a camp completely. This stream maintains good flow through most winters, but its banks are steep and icy, creating fall hazards that could prove fatal. This meadow offers excellent sight lines for spotting game, but it's also exposed enough that predators, animal and human, could spot you with equal ease. Every location presents a puzzle, a complex equation of advantages and disadvantages that you lack the information to solve definitively. You make decisions based on incomplete data and educated guesses, hoping that experience and instinct will compensate for ignorance. By mid-October, you reach your target valley and find it already occupied. Not overcrowded, not yet, but more populated than you've ever seen it at this early date. You count 3 other small brigades setting up winter camps at varying distances around the valley floor, their fires visible in the early dusk like earthbound stars. The sight is both reassuring and alarming. Reassuring because other experienced trappers have made the same calculation you made, validating your decision. Alarming because more trappers means more competition for resources that suddenly seem finite in a way they never did before. You find a campsite on the valley's northern edge, where a small creek emerges from a rocky canyon, and a grove of cottonwoods provides both shelter and building materials. It's not the prime location, that's already claimed by a brigade that arrived days ahead of you, but it's adequate. The canyon provides wind protection, the creek should flow all winter unless temperatures drop to truly catastrophic levels, and the cottonwoods offer bark that horses can eat when grass becomes inaccessible under the snow. Baptiste examines the site with critical eyes and pronounces it acceptable, which from Baptiste is practically a ringing endorsement. MacDonald walks the perimeter in silence, his attention focused on something none of the rest of you can perceive, and eventually nods his approval. Even Thomas seems satisfied, though his satisfaction stems more from the relief of finally stopping than from any sophisticated assessment of the location's qualities. You stand in your chosen spot as the sun sets behind the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink that seem too beautiful for the dangerous world they illuminate. This will be your home for the next 4 or 5 months. This small patch of valley floor, this grove of bare branch trees, this creek that will become the centre of your shrunken universe. You've made your choice. Now you have to live with it. The first task is obvious. Shelter. You have perhaps 2 weeks of reasonable weather remaining, maybe less, and you need to transform this open ground into something that can protect human bodies from temperatures that might drop to 40 or 50 degrees below zero. You need walls and a roof, insulation and ventilation, a fire pit positioned perfectly to provide heat, without smoking you out or burning your shelter down. You've built winter camps before, but never with this level of urgency. never with the knowledge that failure means death. The pressure transforms what used to feel like a routine autumn chore into something approaching sacred ritual. Every decision matters. Every corner cut now will be paid for later with suffering or worse. The mountains wait, patient as always, neither helping nor hindering your preparations. They've witnessed countless winters, countless trappers making similar calculations, countless bodies frozen in camps that seemed adequate until the moment they weren't. You hope your camp won't become another cautionary tale whispered around future rendezvous fires. But hope is a thin garment against the cold that's coming. You pick up your axe and start working. The cottonwood falls with a crash that echoes off the canyon walls, and you're already mentally calculating how many more trees you'll need before this shelter qualifies as shelter rather than optimistic scaffolding. Building a winter lodge in the Rocky Mountains requires a particular kind of expertise, a blend of carpentry, engineering and desperation that no formal education provides. You learned this the hard way during your first mountain winter, when you nearly froze to death in a structure that seemed adequate until the first serious storm revealed every gap, every weakness, every naive assumption you'd built into its construction. You're not making those mistakes again. This time, you're building with the paranoid thoroughness of someone who has already died once from overconfidence and somehow gotten a second chance. The basic structure follows a pattern that mountain men have developed through brutal trial and error over the decades since the fur trade pushed white trappers into these mountains. You're building what's essentially a hybrid between a European cabin and an indigenous lodge, a compromise design that incorporates the strengths of both traditions while adapting to the specific challenges of your materials and location. The frame rises first, cottonwood poles stripped of bark and lashed together in a conical shape that sheds snow and deflects wind. This isn't the elaborate log cabin construction you might have seen in settlements back east. You don't have the time, the tools, or frankly the skill to notch and stack logs into tight-fitting walls. Instead, you're building a skeleton of poles that will support layered coverings, creating shelter through accumulation rather than precision joinery. Baptiste works beside you with the easy competence of someone who's built dozens of these structures, his movements efficient and purposeful, where yours are still fumbling and uncertain. He doesn't explain what he's doing. Baptiste has never been much for verbal instruction, but he positions himself where you can watch and learn, which is instruction enough. The pole frame takes shape over 2 exhausting days, during which you develop blisters on your palms that burst and bleed and reform into calluses that will serve you well through the months ahead. Thomas proves surprisingly useful, his greenhorn ignorance compensated by genuine physical strength and a willingness to work without complaint. MacDonald contributes silently, appearing with cut poles at exactly the moments they're needed, his forest skills evident in every efficient movement. Once the frame is complete, the real work begins. The poles provide structure, but structure alone won't save you when temperatures plummet. You need insulation, layers upon layers of material that will trap air and slow the relentless transfer of heat from your body to the hungry cold outside. The first layer is buffalo hide, and here you're grateful for the successful hunting you did during the autumn weeks before the weather closed in. You drape the hides over the pole framework, flesh side out so the fat residue can help shed moisture. The hides overlap like scales, each one positioned to channel rain and snow melt away from the interior. It's crude work, nowhere near as elegant as the lodges that indigenous peoples construct with generations of accumulated skill. But it's functional, and functional is all you're aiming for. The second layer is grass, enormous quantities of dried grass that you and your companions have been gathering for days, cutting it with knives and bundling it into sheaves that you pack against the hide covering until the walls of your shelter achieve a thickness that would seem absurd in any other context. You want walls at least a foot thick, maybe more. Every inch of insulation represents degrees of warmth retained, minutes of fuel saved, slightly better odds of seeing spring. The third layer is more hide, this time positioned fur side in, creating a smooth interior surface that won't shed debris onto your sleeping bodies. And then, because you're not taking any chances this winter, you add a fourth layer, earth. You pile soil and clay against the lower portions of the shelter walls, banking it up to waist height, creating thermal mass that will store heat during the warmer parts of the day and release it slowly through the brutal nights. By the time you finish, your shelter looks like a natural feature of the landscape, a strange hill that emerged spontaneously from the valley floor, covered in dirt and grass and snow. This is intentional. A shelter that blends into its surroundings presents less of a target to hostile observers, whether those observers are rival trappers, raiding parties, or simply curious bears who might decide your insulated structure looks like an interesting thing to investigate. The interior takes another 2 days to complete. You dig out the floor, lowering it below ground level to take advantage of the Earth's relatively stable temperature. Even in the coldest winter, the ground a few feet down maintains temperatures significantly warmer than the air above. Another lesson learned from indigenous peoples who figured this out centuries before white trappers arrived. You build a fire pit slightly off-centre, positioning it to maximise heat distribution while ensuring smoke can escape through the small hole you've left at the apex of the structure. The fire pit represents one of the most critical engineering challenges of winter survival. You need fire to live, but fire in an enclosed space creates problems that can kill you just as surely as cold. Carbon monoxide poisoning claims trappers every winter, men who seal their shelters too tightly against the cold and asphyxiate themselves in their sleep. You compromise, creating a ventilation system that allows airflow without creating the drafts that would make your shelter unbearable. A small opening near the ground on the windward side draws in fresh air while the smoke hole at the top creates a natural chimney effect. It's not perfect. Nothing in mountain survival is ever perfect, but it should keep you alive. The sleeping platforms require particular attention. You build raised beds from poles and grass, elevating your sleeping bodies above the coldest layer of air that pools on the floor like an invisible lake. You line the platforms with more grass and top them with your buffalo robes, creating sleeping surfaces that will provide crucial insulation from below as well as above. Historians still argue whether mountain men like yourself were genuinely innovative, or whether you simply copied techniques from indigenous peoples while claiming credit for the adaptation. Standing in your completed shelter, you're not particularly interested in the debate over intellectual property. You've borrowed from everyone, from the French-Canadian trappers who taught Baptiste, from the indigenous peoples who've survived here for millennia, from your own painful experience of nearly dying in inadequate shelters. The result is a structure that represents accumulated wisdom from multiple traditions, and if it keeps you alive, you don't particularly care who gets credit. The shelter construction reveals something important about your small brigade. You work well together. Baptiste brings experience, you bring stubbornness, MacDonald brings mysterious competence, and Thomas brings youth and strength. It's a good combination, good enough that you start feeling something resembling hope for the first time since the Rendezvous ended. But shelter alone won't save you. The structure you've built will protect you from wind and snow and the worst direct cold, but it won't generate heat on its own. For that, you need fuel, enormous quantities of wood that will feed your fire through months of burning. You start cutting firewood with the same paranoid intensity you brought to shelter construction. Baptiste teaches you the mathematics of winter fuel consumption, roughly 1 cord of wood per month for a shelter your size, more in the coldest periods, less if you're willing to suffer. A cord of wood is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. You need at least 5 cords to guarantee survival, preferably 6 or 7 to provide a margin of error. Cutting and stacking that much wood in the time remaining before serious winter arrives would be challenging under ideal conditions. Under actual conditions, with snow already on the ground and temperatures dropping daily, it verges on impossible. You work from first light until darkness drives you back to shelter, your axe swinging in rhythms that become automatic, your body operating on reserves you didn't know you possessed. By the end of October, you've accumulated something close to adequate fuel reserves. The wood is stacked in neat ricks under improvised shelters that will keep the worst snow off it. Wet wood burns poorly, and poorly burning wood means inadequate heat, and inadequate heat means death. You've positioned the fuel close enough to your shelter for convenient access, but far enough that a spark from your fire won't ignite your entire winter supply. Your shelter stands complete, walls thick enough to stop the worst cold, floor dug into the earth's insulation, fire pit properly ventilated, fuel stockpiled against months of need. It's not pretty, it's not permanent, it's not even particularly comfortable by any standard you might have held before entering these mountains, but it might save your life. You crawl inside as the October sun sets early behind the mountains, and you feel the strange satisfaction of the prepared, not confident. Confidence would be stupid given what you're facing, but prepared, ready. As ready as any human can be for what these mountains are about to deliver. Outside, the wind picks up, testing your construction with probing gusts that find the small gaps you haven't managed to eliminate. Inside, your fire crackles with reassuring warmth, casting shadows on walls that represent weeks of brutal labour. This is your fortress. Your survival depends on whether you've built it well enough. Only winter will tell. The food cache you're digging represents either brilliant foresight or supreme optimism, and you're not entirely sure which. You've spent the week since completing your shelter hunting with desperate intensity, bringing down elk and deer whenever opportunity presents itself, working through the bloody process of butchering and preserving meat with efficiency born of necessity. Now you're burying the results of that labour, lowering bundles of pemmican and dried meat into holes you've excavated in the frozen earth with aching arms and bleeding knuckles. The digging alone takes days. Ground that seemed soft in summer has already hardened into something approaching concrete, resistant to every tool you possess. Pemmican is your primary survival food, and you've made enough of it to feel almost wealthy by mountain standards. The recipe is simple, but the execution is brutal. Dried meat pounded to powder, mixed with rendered fat, sometimes augmented with dried berries if you've had time and luck to gather them. The result is a dense, shelf-stable substance that provides enormous calories in minimal volume. A food technology that indigenous peoples perfected over generations and trappers have gratefully adopted. You've made your pemmican from elk meat, primarily, with some deer mixed in when elk weren't available. The fat came from the same animals, rendered over low fires until it achieved the liquid clarity that indicates proper processing. You didn't add berries. There wasn't time, and berries are a luxury anyway, a flavour enhancement that matters less than the raw calories you need to survive. The bundles you're burying represent roughly 30 pounds of pemmican each, enough calories to sustain a single man for several weeks if he's careful, less if he's working hard and burning through energy reserves at accelerated rates. You're burying 6 bundles at different locations around your camp, creating a distributed network of food storage that provides redundancy against disaster. The redundancy matters because everything in the mountains wants your food. Wolves want it. They'll dig through snow and frozen earth with determined patience to reach cached meat. Bears want it. Some of them don't hibernate completely and might investigate an interesting smell even in deep winter. Ravens want it. They'll find any cache that's not perfectly concealed and peck through whatever protection you've provided. And other trappers want it. Not that you expect direct theft from men you know and trust, but desperate men in a desperate winter might rationalise behaviour they'd never consider under normal circumstances. So you distribute your caches and you camouflage them with paranoid thoroughness. Each burial site gets marked with a system of signs that you'll recognise but that should appear random to anyone who doesn't know what to look for. A specific arrangement of rocks, a particular pattern of blazes on nearby trees, landmarks that you've memorised even though you're recording them in the small notebook you carry for exactly this purpose. Baptiste watches your elaborate concealment efforts with amusement that he doesn't bother hiding. In 50 years, he says, I have never had another trapper steal my food cache. There's a first time for everything, you reply, tamping down the last of the disturbed earth over your final burial site. Baptiste shrugs, conceding the point with characteristic economy. He's right that theft is relatively rare among mountain men. The fur trade operates on networks of trust and reputation that make stealing from colleagues remarkably bad business practice. But he's also a man who's never experienced a winter as bad as the one you're all sensing in the air. Desperation changes calculations, and you'd rather plan for the worst and be pleasantly surprised. The distribution of food between your small brigade has required delicate negotiation that you're glad is mostly complete. Each man maintains his own supplies, earned through his own hunting and preparation, but there's an understanding that the group shares a collective fate. If one man's cache is destroyed by predators or discovered by raiders, the others will share from their supplies. If one man proves unable to hunt effectively, the others won't let him starve. This communal assumption creates complicated mathematics. You're effectively betting your survival on the competence and luck of 3 other men, each of whom is making the same bet on you. It's a reasonable arrangement when everyone has adequate supplies, shared risk, shared insurance. But if supplies run short, the arrangement could collapse into calculation and selfishness that destroys the group faster than any weather. Thomas contributes the least to the collective food stores, which surprises no one but troubles everyone. He's a hard worker, Thomas, but he's not a skilled hunter, and his greenhorn mistakes have cost the brigade several animals that more experienced trappers would have brought down cleanly. His cache is perhaps half the size of yours, enough for survival if nothing goes wrong, but dangerously inadequate if winter proves as severe as all the signs suggest. Nobody says anything directly, but you can feel the tension in the group's calculations. Will Thomas's inadequate supplies become everyone's problem? Will his greenhorn improvidence drag the rest of you towards starvation? The questions remain unspoken, but they flavour every interaction with a subtle bitterness that you wish you could eliminate. You supplement your pemmican caches with other preserved foods that provide variety if not volume. Dried fish from the autumn salmon runs, jerked strips of meat that you'll use for quick meals when pemmican's dense monotony becomes intolerable, a small quantity of dried berries that you're saving for emergencies when psychological comfort becomes as important as calories. Historians still argue whether mountain men faced greater danger from starvation or from violence in their annual rhythm of trapping and trading. The statistics favour violence. More trappers died from conflict with indigenous peoples and from accidents than from pure starvation. But the statistics hide the reality that starvation weakened men for other forms of death, that hunger made trappers desperate enough to take risks they'd never accept when fed, that the calories you're burying now will determine not just whether you starve, but whether you have the strength and judgment to survive everything else winter will throw at you. The wolves become aware of your caches almost immediately. You see them in the tree line, grey shadows that watch your burial activities with professional interest. They've probably already investigated your shelter, tested your perimeter, evaluated your position as potential prey, or at least as potential competitors for the valley's limited resources. These wolves are not the timid creatures you might have encountered in more settled territories. Mountain wolves have learned that humans represent danger, but they've also learned that humans represent opportunity. Where humans go, food often follows. Scraps, kills, caches that might be breached with enough persistence. The wolves maintain a cautious distance, but you can feel their attention, their calculation, their patient willingness to wait for opportunity. You implement countermeasures that Baptiste recommends from decades of experience. You urinate around your cache sites, marking territory in the most primitive way possible. You scatter pine boughs that carry your scent. You bury your caches deep enough that casual digging won't reach them. And you accept that despite everything, you'll probably lose some supplies to predation over the winter. The only question is how much. The psychological weight of your food preparation proves as significant as the physical labour. Each cache you complete represents a vote for survival, a small deposit in an account you're hoping will sustain you until spring. The work grounds you in concrete activity, gives you something to control in a situation that often feels completely beyond your control. By November, your food preparation is as complete as time allows. The caches are buried, the inventory is memorised, the mathematics of survival have been calculated and recalculated until the numbers have lost meaning through repetition. You have enough, probably, assuming nothing goes wrong. Nothing ever goes wrong in the mountains, though. That's definitely not how it works. You add one final cache, smaller than the others, hidden with even greater care, known only to you. Baptiste would probably disapprove if he knew about your private reserve, would see it as evidence of insufficient trust in the communal arrangement. But you've learned that survival sometimes requires insurance policies that your companions don't know about. You hope you never need it. But the mountains have taught you to hope for the best while burying food for the worst. The first serious snow of November begins falling as you tamp down the earth over your secret cache. Fat flakes that land on your shoulders and melt into your buckskin with a wetness that promises much worse to come. Winter is here. Your preparations are complete, or they're not, and you'll discover your failures soon enough. Either way, the waiting is over. Your hands move over the collection of metal and leather spread before you, conducting an inventory so thorough that your fingers memorize every scratch, every worn edge, every weakness waiting to fail at the worst possible moment. These are your traps. 6 steel beaver traps that represent not just your livelihood but your survival. A mountain man without functioning traps is a mountain man without trade goods, and a mountain man without trade goods is eventually a dead man. The traps themselves are beautiful in their brutal simplicity. Steel jaws mounted on strong springs, designed to close with enough force to hold a struggling beaver until you arrive to dispatch it and claim the pelt. Each trap weighs maybe 5 pounds when you include the chain and stake, light enough to carry, heavy enough to matter after miles of walking through deep snow. The design hasn't changed significantly in decades, and won't change significantly for decades to come. Sometimes the simple solutions prove most enduring. You examine each trap with the attention of a surgeon evaluating instruments before a critical operation. Spring tension first. You compress the springs and feel for weakness, for the subtle loss of resistance that indicates metal fatigue or impending failure. A trap with weak springs is worse than no trap at all, since it might catch a beaver but fail to hold it, wasting your time and alerting the entire beaver colony that danger lurks in their pond. The jaws come next. You run your fingers along the edges, feeling for nicks or rough spots where the metal has been damaged. Beaver are surprisingly powerful creatures, and their struggles against trap jaws create stress that accumulates over time. A jaw that looked fine last spring might have developed weaknesses you can't see, but that will manifest at exactly the wrong moment. The pan, the pressure plate that triggers the trap, requires delicate calibration. Too sensitive and the trap springs on every floating stick and water current. Too resistant and beavers learn to avoid the pan, stepping around the trigger with an intelligence that still surprises you after years of trapping. You adjust each pan to your personal preference, a sensitivity that took seasons to develop and that you couldn't explain even if someone asked. Your chain links get individual examination. A broken chain means a lost trap and a lost beaver, since the animal will drag your equipment into deep water or into its lodge, and you'll never see either again. The links show wear from years of use, rust spots that you scrub away with desperate attention, weak points that you reinforce with improvised patches that you hope will hold. Baptiste watches your obsessive inventory with an expression that mixes approval with amusement. You check traps like a man expecting trouble, he observes. I'm expecting winter, you reply, which is the same thing. Your skinning knife is next. This blade has been your constant companion for years, an extension of your hand that you've sharpened so many times that the original factory profile has completely disappeared, replaced by a curved geometry that reflects your personal cutting style. You test the edge against your thumb, feeling the bite that indicates proper sharpness, and you strop the blade anyway because there's no such thing as too sharp when you're skinning beaver in freezing conditions. The backup knife gets similar treatment. You carry two blades for the same reason you carry extra ammunition, and maintain multiple food caches. Redundancy against the certainty that things will go wrong. Your backup is a simpler blade, not as refined as your primary, but serviceable enough that you could complete a winter's trapping with it if necessary. Your powder horn hangs from its strap like a leather question mark, curving around the black powder that represents your ability to hunt, to defend yourself, to signal for help in extremity. You check the seal obsessively, ensuring no moisture has penetrated to dampen the powder inside. Wet powder doesn't fire, and powder that doesn't fire transforms your rifle from a weapon into an awkward club. You have perhaps 3 pounds of powder remaining after autumn. Hunting depleted your supplies more than you'd planned. It's enough for the winter if you're careful, if you make every shot count, if you don't face any emergencies that require sustained defense. It's not enough to be wasteful, to take uncertain shots, to use your rifle for anything other than essential purposes. The lead for your balls is similarly finite. You've cast what ammunition you could before winter fully arrived, but the process requires heat and time that become increasingly precious as temperatures drop. You have maybe 70 balls remaining, each one representing a potential meal or a potential salvation, depending on what circumstances require. Your Hawken rifle receives attention that borders on reverent. This weapon costs more than everything else you own combined, but it earns its price through reliability that has saved your life more than once. The 50 caliber barrel delivers enough power to drop elk at distances that still amaze you, and the craftsmanship that Jacob Hawken built into every piece ensures function in conditions that would destroy lesser weapons. You clean the barrel with patches soaked in animal fat, removing residue that accumulated during autumn hunting. You examine the lock mechanism, the flint, the frizzen, the pan that holds the priming powder, and replace the flint with a fresh one that will spark reliably through the months ahead. You check the stock for cracks that might propagate under stress, the bands that hold barrel to wood, the trigger that must release crisply and predictably every time. Historians still argue whether mountain men were genuine marksmen, or whether their reputation for shooting prowess was exaggerated by frontier mythology. The truth you suspect lies somewhere in between. You're good enough to hit what you aim at under reasonable conditions, But reasonable conditions rarely describe mountain winters. Cold numbs your fingers and slows your reflexes. Wind deflects balls in unpredictable ways. Animals move and vanish and refuse to present clean shots. The marksmanship that seemed adequate at the summer rendezvous becomes marginal at best when everything conspires against accuracy. Your other tools receive similar scrutiny. The hatchet that serves for light chopping and emergency splitting. The awl and sinew for repairs that will inevitably become necessary. The flint and steel that represent your last resort for fire-making when everything else fails. The steel trap springs that allow you to set your devices without cutting your hands on the powerful jaws. Each tool represents capability, the ability to accomplish some essential task that survival requires. Lose a tool and you lose capability. Lose enough capability and you lose everything. The mathematics are simple but inexorable, which is why you're sitting here in fading November light, running your hands over metal and leather with the intensity of a man memorizing the face of a lover he might never see again. The other members of your brigade conduct similar inventories, each man examining his equipment with the seriousness that the situation demands. Thomas's gear is newer but less refined, factory fresh in some ways, but lacking the personal modifications that experience teaches. Baptiste's equipment is ancient and patched and probably held together by habit more than function. But it works because Baptiste makes it work through sheer stubborn competence. MacDonald's tools are, like MacDonald himself, mysteriously capable and largely unexplained. You pack everything carefully, arranging your trapping kit in the order you'll need to access items during actual use. Traps at the bottom since you won't set them until you reach the beaver ponds. Skinning knife readily accessible since you'll need it immediately upon making a catch. Powder horn and ammunition distributed for weight balance. Spare supplies tucked into gaps where they'll stay secure during travel. The weight of your complete kit surprises you every time you lift it. 30 pounds or more of equipment that you'll carry through snow and over mountains and across frozen streams for months. Your body will adapt, building strength and endurance that you don't currently possess. Or it won't adapt and you'll fail. There's no third option. Night falls while you complete your inventory. Darkness arriving with the shocking earliness that November brings to these latitudes. You retreat to your shelter with your equipment arranged and ready. Your tools prepared for the work ahead. Tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, you'll begin actually trapping. The beaver are out there in their lodges, their pelts growing thick and valuable in the cold water, waiting for you to come and harvest them with all the skill and equipment you've assembled. But tonight, you rest. You've done everything you can to prepare. Whatever happens next is between you and the mountains. The blizzard arrives on October 17th with a violence that makes everything you thought you knew about winter seem naive. You're a mile from your shelter when the sky goes from grey to green to a swirling white chaos that erases the world in what feels like seconds. One moment you can see the tree line, the next moment you can't see your hand in front of your face. This isn't the gentle snowfall of a week ago. This is weather as assault, wind that hits you like a physical force, snow that drives horizontally into every gap in your clothing, cold that finds the warm places you thought were protected, and murders them with efficient malice. You drop to your knees in the first desperate seconds, understanding instinctively that standing upright in this wind is an invitation to be blown off your feet and lost completely. Patience, your horse, screams behind you, a sound you've never heard her make, terror given voice in a way that adds to your own fear rather than diminishing it. Your mind races through survival protocols even as your body reacts to immediate dangers. Find shelter, any shelter, a rock outcropping, a fallen tree, a depression in the ground, anything that breaks the wind and gives you a chance to survive until this initial violence passes or until you can find your way back to camp. But there is no shelter visible in the white chaos. There is nothing visible. The blizzard has created a universe of uniform white fury where direction becomes meaningless and distance becomes impossible to judge. You could be 10 feet from salvation or 100 feet from a cliff edge. The information content of your environment has collapsed to zero. You remember Baptiste's advice, given casually over a fire weeks ago. In a whiteout, you stay put. Moving kills. Stillness might save you. The advice seemed obvious at the time, almost insulting in its simplicity. Now, crouched in the snow with wind stripping heat from your body at a rate you can feel, the advice seems like sacred wisdom. You grab Patience's lead rope, The mare is panicking now, pulling against your grip with strength that threatens to yank you off your feet, and you force her to the ground with you. A standing horse presents a sail surface to the wind, a target for the elements. A prone horse, while not happy about the position, survives where a standing horse might be blown over or might bolt into the whiteout and be lost forever. The process of getting a terrified horse to lie down in a blizzard would be comical under other circumstances. Patience resists, plants her hooves, tosses her head with wild-eyed panic. You use every horse-handling trick you've learned, every technique for gaining an animal's trust in crisis, and eventually, after long minutes that feel like hours, she collapses beside you with a groaning surrender that you feel in your own bones. You curl against her windward side, using her bulk as a windbreak, pulling your buffalo robe over both of you in a configuration that looks ridiculous and might save your life. The heat of her body, horses run warm, warmer than you've ever appreciated until this moment, creates a microclimate against the killing wind. The first hour is survivable, the second hour is endurable. By the third hour you've entered a mental space that feels something like meditation, a calm acceptance of circumstances you cannot change, a focus on the present moment because thinking about the future creates panic that consumes energy you can't afford to spend. The snow accumulates around you, burying you and Patience in a white tomb that, paradoxically, improves your situation. Snow is an excellent insulator. The drift forming over your bodies reduces wind exposure and traps warmth that would otherwise escape into the atmosphere. You've heard stories of trappers surviving blizzards buried in snowbanks. Apparently you're testing whether those stories are true. MacDonald finds you sometime in the 5th hour, appearing from the white chaos like a ghost with purpose. You never learn how he tracked you through conditions that should have made tracking impossible. MacDonald never explains his methods, and you've stopped asking. He takes Patience's lead rope without speaking, gestures for you to follow, and begins walking into the blizzard with a confidence that suggests he can see something you cannot. The journey back to camp takes another hour, following MacDonald through a landscape that remains formless and terrifying, but that he navigates with apparent ease. Several times you're certain you've been walking in circles. Several times you consider stopping, curling up, letting the snow bury you again since that seemed to work before. But MacDonald keeps moving, and you keep following, and eventually the outline of your shelter emerges from the white. Inside, Baptiste and Thomas wait with a fire that feels like the centre of existence. You collapse near the flames with a shuddering that's half cold and half relief, and you don't move for a long time except to accept the warm broth that Baptiste presses into your shaking hands. The blizzard continues for 3 more days. You emerge from your shelter periodically to check on Patience. She's survived, sheltered in a crude windbreak you constructed weeks ago, and to dig out the entrance from accumulating snow. But mostly you wait, trapped in a structure that suddenly seems very small, burning through firewood at a rate that makes your careful calculations seem optimistic. When the storm finally breaks, the world is transformed. Snow lies several feet deep across the valley, drifted higher where wind created accumulations that will persist until spring. The temperature has dropped by 30 degrees from pre-storm levels, and your breath creates clouds that hang in the still air like reluctant ghosts. You learn later that this blizzard killed at least a dozen trappers across the mountains, men caught in the open, men whose shelters proved inadequate, men who made the fatal mistake of trying to travel through conditions that permitted no travel. You learn that hundreds of horses died, their bodies frozen in positions of final desperation, their value as transportation transformed overnight into value as emergency food. You also learn that this blizzard was merely the beginning. The old-timers who survived are calling it a taste, an appetizer before the main course of winter that's still months from arriving. If October delivers this level of violence, what will January bring? The question haunts your nights as you lie in your shelter, listening to wind that seems to whisper threats in languages you almost understand. You've survived one storm. How many more can you survive before your luck, your supplies, or your will to continue finally expires? The answer, of course, is that you'll survive as many as you have to, or you won't survive, and someone will find your body in spring and add your story to the collection of cautionary tales that mountain men tell around rendezvous fires. There's no third option. The fire dies at 3 in the morning on the coldest night you've yet experienced, and you wake to darkness so complete that you can't tell whether your eyes are open or closed. For one disorienting moment, you wonder if you've died. If this is what death feels like, cold and dark and strangely peaceful, then the cold bites deeper, and you know you're alive because the dead don't shiver. You fumble for the fire pit by memory, your hands too numb to provide useful feedback. The coals should still be there, buried under ash, providing a foundation for rebuilding the fire that's keeping you alive. Your fingers find warmth, faint, dying but present, and you begin the delicate work of resurrection that might save your life. Firecraft in winter conditions is an art form that separates survivors from corpses. You learned the basics years ago, when you first entered these mountains with the overconfidence of youth and the ignorance of inexperience. But the basics prove insufficient when your hands won't cooperate, when your tinder is damp, when the cold pressing against your shelter walls seems determined to extinguish any spark you manage to create. Your tinder bundle sits in the warmest part of the shelter, protected from moisture with paranoid care. You've assembled it from cottonwood bark shredded to hair-fine filaments, dried grass selected for the particular brittleness that indicates proper curing, and a small quantity of charred cloth that you prepared specifically for nights like this. The bundle should catch from a spark, that's the theory anyway. Your flint and steel feel like foreign objects in your numb hands. The precise striking motion that produces sparks requires coordination you currently lack, fine motor control that the cold has stolen along with your body heat. You strike once, twice, 3 times, producing nothing but frustration and the dull sound of metal on stone. Baptiste stirs somewhere in the darkness. "Breathe on your hands," he says, his voice rough with sleep. "Warm them first. Cold hands make no fire." You cup your hands over your mouth and exhale, warm breath creating temporary relief that you know won't last. You flex your fingers trying to restore circulation, and you feel the painful tingling that indicates blood returning to extremities that had begun their retreat toward your core. You strike again. This time a spark arcs from the contact, a tiny meteor that lands somewhere in the darkness without effect. You strike again, and finally a spark lands in your tinder bundle, with a faint orange glow that might be the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. The next minutes are critical. You cup your hands around the smoking bundle, adding your breath to encourage the ember, feeding it oxygen while protecting it from the cold air that threatens to extinguish it. The smoke increases, the glow brightens, and then, finally gloriously, a flame appears. You add kindling with hands that tremble from cold and relief. Small twigs first, then larger pieces, then split wood that catches and burns with the steady heat that means survival. Within 10 minutes, the fire is restored, casting dancing shadows on the shelter walls, pushing back the darkness that had seemed so final. You lie near the fire for a long time, absorbing heat that seems to soak into your bones, and you think about how close you came to disaster. A man who sleeps through a dead fire in these conditions often doesn't wake up. The cold settles in gradually, lowering body temperature degree by degree until the shivering stops, and a peaceful warmth spreads through limbs that have begun to die. Mountain men have found their companions frozen in postures of sleep, faces carrying expressions of false comfort, bodies stiff with the cold they no longer felt. The experience teaches you lessons you incorporate immediately. You never again let the fire die completely. Someone is always awake, feeding flames, maintaining the heat that keeps you all alive. You position your tinder bundle where you can find it by touch in total darkness. You practice the striking motion until it becomes automatic, until you can produce sparks even when your hands are numb and your mind is foggy with cold and exhaustion. Baptiste shares additional fire wisdom over the following days. He teaches you about fire lays, the specific arrangements of fuel that burn most efficiently in different conditions. He shows you how to create a long fire with 2 large logs positioned to burn toward each other through the night, providing steady heat that requires less constant attention. He demonstrates the technique of banking coals, burying hot embers under ash to preserve them for hours until morning. Some of what Baptiste teaches you seems to come from indigenous traditions, fire knowledge developed over generations by people who survived in these mountains long before white trappers arrived. Some seems to come from his own decades of experience, hard-won wisdom earned through suffering you can only imagine. He never explains his sources, and you never ask, because what matters is that the knowledge works. You learn about fuel selection, the differences between wood types that become critical when you're burning through your carefully stockpiled supplies. Cottonwood burns fast and hot, useful for quick heating but wasteful for overnight fires. Pine burns slower but produces dangerous amounts of creosote that coat your shelter with flammable residue. Aspen provides good balance between heat output and burn duration, and you regret that you didn't gather more of it before winter closed in completely. The psychological dimension of firecraft proves as important as the technical skills. Fire provides more than heat. It provides light in the darkest months, comfort in isolation, a focal point for the small rituals that keep you sane. You find yourself staring into flames for long periods, watching the dance of orange and yellow and blue, finding patterns that probably aren't there but that occupy your mind during hours that would otherwise fill with fear and boredom. Historians still argue whether fire was more important for warmth or for psychological stability in the lives of prehistoric humans. Living through this winter, you discover the question is meaningless. Fire is both. Inseparably, the physical and the psychological woven together so completely that distinguishing them becomes impossible. You establish fire rituals that structure your days. Morning fire building, when the night's carefully banked coals are coaxed back to full flame. Midday fire maintenance, when you add fuel and adjust the burn pattern for efficiency. Evening fire building, when you prepare the configuration that will carry you through the dangerous night hours. The rituals provide rhythm, and rhythm provides sanity, and sanity might prove as important as warmth before spring arrives. The fire crackles before you now, reliable and warm, pushing back against a darkness that seems to have weight and intention. You add another piece of wood, adjust the burning logs for optimal heat distribution, and settle back against your sleeping platform with something approaching contentment. You've mastered fire, or at least you've achieved competence. Tomorrow the cold will test that competence, and the day after, and every day until spring. But for now the fire burns, the elk have vanished. You've been searching for 3 days through snow that reaches your thighs in the valleys, and your chest in the drifts, and you found nothing but tracks so old they've frozen into blue ice sculptures. The herds that seemed abundant just weeks ago have retreated south or died, or simply evaporated into the white landscape that refuses to yield answers. Your stomach has become a constant presence in your consciousness, demanding attention it never demanded when food was reliable. You're not starving yet. Your pemmican caches remain intact, and you've been rationing carefully, but you're running calculations in your head that make disturbing mathematics visible. Calories consumed versus calories available. Days until supplies reach critical levels. The gap between what you need and what you have, measured in meals and weeks and survival percentages. Hunting in deep winter requires adaptations that feel almost like learning a new profession. The techniques that work in autumn, patient stalking, careful positioning, clean shots at grazing animals, become irrelevant when the game refuses to show itself. You have to become something different, more desperate, more creative, more willing to accept prey you would have disdained in easier times. You set snares for rabbits, following Baptiste's instructions for loop size and positioning. The snares are simple wire loops suspended in game trails, designed to catch rabbits around the neck as they hop through. It's not glamorous hunting, nothing like the rifle and elk drama that defines mountain man mythology. But rabbits provide calories, and calories are what you need. The first rabbit appears in your snare after 2 days of waiting. It's a small thing, maybe 2 pounds dressed out, providing barely enough meat for a single meal shared among 4 men. But it's fresh meat, warm meat that represents proof that hunting is still possible, even as larger game has disappeared. You learn to read winter sign with new attention, the faint depressions in snow that indicate game trails beneath the surface, the peculiar coloration of bark where animals have gnawed for sustenance, the droppings that remain visible despite accumulated snow, providing evidence of animal presence that you can track backward toward living creatures. MacDonald proves invaluable during these hungry weeks. His hunting skills seem to operate on frequencies the rest of you can't access. He returns from solitary expeditions with game when the rest of you find nothing, and he never explains his methods except in fragments you can barely interpret. The animals leave more than tracks, he says once. They leave intention. You can see where they wanted to go. You have no idea what this means, but MacDonald's results speak for themselves. The small game that sustains you through November includes creatures you would have ignored in better times. Squirrels when you can find them, porcupines, slow enough to catch but dangerous to handle without getting quilled. Even mice when desperation drives you to dig out burrows and harvest the tiny bodies that barely seem worth the effort. You discover that prairie dogs, dormant in their underground colonies, can be dug from their burrows with sufficient determination. The digging is brutal work, frozen earth resisting every thrust of your blade, but the colonies contain dozens of animals, each one representing calories you can't afford to dismiss. Baptiste calls this technique farming instead of hunting, and his tone suggests he views it as necessary indignity rather than a genuine skill. The mathematics of winter hunting force uncomfortable priorities. Energy spent must be compared against energy gained, with brutal honesty about whether an expedition is worth the calories it will cost. Sometimes the calculation says stay in shelter, conserve body heat, live off cash supplies until conditions improve. Sometimes the calculation says hunt despite the cost, because supplies are finite and the winter is long. You become obsessive about field dressing, refusing to waste any part of any animal. The meat goes for eating, obviously. The fat gets rendered for cooking, and for the high-calorie addition to pemmican that makes the difference between survival and starvation. The bones get boiled for broth that provides nutrients you can't get from muscle meat alone. The hides get saved for repairs and patches and emergency insulation. The organs, liver, heart, kidneys, get eaten immediately, providing nutrients that prevent diseases you've seen claim other trappers. The native peoples who winter nearby demonstrate hunting techniques that humble you with their sophistication. You watch a Shoshone hunting party drive deer toward a narrow canyon, where concealed hunters wait with bows. The coordination's remarkable. Dozens of people working together across miles of territory, each person knowing their role, the whole operation functioning with an efficiency that your small brigade could never match. You try to adapt what you observe, but the techniques require numbers you don't have and coordination you haven't practiced. Your brigade is 4 men, not 40, and you lack the generations of accumulated knowledge that make such cooperative hunting possible. You settle for smaller adaptations, better reading of terrain, improved understanding of animal behaviour, and you hope these marginal improvements will prove sufficient. Historians still argue whether mountain men were skilled hunters or merely adequate ones, whether their hunting techniques represented genuine innovation or borrowed knowledge from indigenous peoples. The distinction matters less when you're measuring your remaining supplies against the months remaining until spring. What matters is killing something, anything, that will extend your survival by another day. December arrives with temperatures that make November seem balmy, and the hunting becomes even more difficult. Game retreats to the most sheltered locations, places where snow depth prevents all but the most determined travel. You spend entire days moving through terrain that seems designed to kill you, breaking trail through drifts that swallow you to the shoulders, and returning to shelter with nothing to show for your effort except exhaustion and despair. The hunger that accompanies these failed expeditions has a particular quality, not the sharp pain of missed meals, but a dull ache that settles into your bones and clouds your thinking. You make mistakes you wouldn't make when fed. You take risks you wouldn't take when thinking clearly. The hunger becomes another enemy, as dangerous as the cold, threatening you from the inside while the weather threatens from without. You return to camp after another fruitless hunt, your body screaming for rest and food, and you find Baptiste preparing a thin stew from supplies that seem to grow smaller every time you look at them. "We need bigger game," you say, stating the obvious because the obvious needs stating. Baptiste nods. "The elk will come back, or we will find them, or we will not." It's not much of a comfort, but in this winter of diminishing expectations, you've learned to accept what comfort you can find. The silence becomes a presence in your shelter, a fifth occupant that takes up space you can't spare. You've spent weeks now in close quarters with 3 other men, conversation exhausted, stories told and retold until they've lost all meaning. The simple fact of human company transformed from comfort into irritant. You find yourself fantasizing about solitude, even as you understand that solitude in these conditions would kill you. The psychology of winter isolation has claimed mountain men before. You've heard the stories at Rendezvous, told with the uncomfortable laughter that men use when discussing threats they can't fight with rifles. Trappers who emerged in spring speaking to companions no one else could see. Trappers who wandered into storms chasing visions that existed only in their starving minds. Trappers who simply gave up, lying down in the snow with the calm resignation of men who'd decided that death was preferable to another month of frozen waiting. You're not there yet. You're not even close, you tell yourself. But you can feel the edge of something in your mind, a boundary you don't want to approach, much less cross. The days blur together in a rhythm of survival tasks that provide structure without meaning. Wake in darkness, build up the fire, check the weather through the small gap you've left for ventilation. Make a decision about whether conditions permit activity outside the shelter. If yes, hunting or trap checking or the endless work of firewood gathering. If no, another day in the confined space with men you're coming to resent for no reason beyond their presence. Baptiste handles the isolation with a serenity that you envy and that irritates you in equal measure. He's spent more winters in these mountains than you can count, and he seems to have made peace with the confinement in ways you haven't figured out. He occupies himself with small tasks, mending equipment, braiding leather, carving designs into wood that serve no purpose except to consume time, and he rarely speaks unless speech is necessary. Thomas handles it badly. The greenhorn vibrates with nervous energy that has nowhere to go, and his constant fidgeting creates tensions that the rest of you feel but don't address directly. He asks questions that have no answers, makes jokes that aren't funny, starts conversations that trail off into awkward silence. His need for interaction conflicts with the rest of you's need for peace, and the conflict builds pressure you're not sure how to release. MacDonald handles it by disappearing. He leaves the shelter for long periods, returning hours later without explanation, and nobody asks where he goes because nobody wants to know. His solitary expeditions provide the group with necessary space, and you're grateful for his absence even as you worry about him dying alone in the snow. You occupy yourself with thoughts, though thinking without books or companions or any external input eventually becomes its own form of torture. You review your life, examining memories with the obsessive attention of someone with nothing else to examine. You plan futures you may not live to experience. You compose letters in your head to family members who may never receive any letter from you again. The philosophical questions arrive unbidden. What is the point of all this? Why did you choose this life? What are you trying to prove, and to whom are you trying to prove it? The questions don't have answers, which makes them both fascinating and frustrating. You can occupy yourself for hours contemplating existence, but you never arrive anywhere satisfying, and the arrival would probably not help even if you achieved it. You find yourself talking to the fire, narrating your actions in a low voice that doesn't disturb the others, but that provides the comfort of hearing human speech, even if it's your own. Adding another log now, adjusting the burn pattern, fire seems steady. The narration is absurd. You know it's absurd, but the absurdity matters less than the psychological benefit. The concept of time distorts in ways you didn't expect. Days lose their individual identity, flowing together into an undifferentiated stream of cold and darkness and routine. You lose track of dates entirely until Baptiste, who maintains some system of calendar keeping you don't understand, announces that Christmas has arrived. Christmas in the shelter feels less like celebration than like cruel joke. You have no gifts to exchange, no feast to prepare, no decorations to brighten the monotonous space. But Baptiste insists on marking the day somehow, and so you share a slightly larger meal than usual, an extravagance that your carefully maintained rations can barely afford, and you tell stories of Christmases past in the lives you lived before the mountains claimed you. Thomas describes a Kentucky Christmas with family gathered and food abundant and snow that fell gently outside windows that kept it where it belonged. Outside. His description creates homesickness you didn't know you still possessed, a yearning for places and people you haven't thought about in years. Baptiste describes a Christmas in Montreal, decades ago, before he came west and discovered the life that would define him. His story involves a girl he almost married and a decision he still wonders about. "Some doors close behind you," he says, staring into the fire with an expression that makes you look away. MacDonald says nothing, as usual, but his silence seems heavier than normal, a silence filled with memories he doesn't share. You describe your own Christmas past, a composite of several years that merge in your memory into a single idealized celebration. Family and food and warmth and the innocent assumption that warmth was normal, that abundance was the natural state of human existence. That assumption seems almost laughable now, crouched in a shelter where cold seeps through walls that seemed adequate when you built them, and where food must be rationed with mathematical precision. Historians still argue whether mountain men were psychologically damaged by their chosen lifestyle or whether they were psychologically suited to it in ways that made them different from ordinary people. Living through this isolation, you suspect the answer is both, that the mountains select for certain psychological profiles while simultaneously shaping the minds of everyone who survives them. The Christmas observance passes and the days resume their undifferentiated flow. January looms ahead like a physical obstacle you'll have to climb over, then February, then March, then maybe, if you survive that long, the first signs of spring. The silence settles back around you, familiar now if not comfortable. You've made a kind of peace with it, or at least a truce that allows you to continue functioning. The alternative is madness, and madness leads to death, and death is not acceptable when you've come this far. The decision to winter together rather than apart seemed obvious in October, when abundance permitted generosity. Now, in the depths of January, you're questioning every assumption that led to this arrangement. 4 men sharing space and supplies, and the increasingly heavy burden of each other's presence. The mathematics of partnership present themselves daily in calculations you can't ignore. 4 men consume more food than 1 man would, obviously, but 4 men also hunt more effectively, gather more firewood, maintain more vigilant watches. The question is whether the multiplication of capacity exceeds the multiplication of consumption, and the answer keeps shifting depending on how you measure. Your food stores have declined more rapidly than projected. Part of this is the simple reality of a winter worse than expected. You've been consuming more calories because the cold demands more calories, burning through reserves that seemed generous in autumn and now seem dangerously inadequate. But part of it is also the presence of Thomas, whose preparation proved inadequate and whose hunting contributions barely offset his consumption. Nobody discusses the Thomas problem directly, but it haunts every shared meal. Baptiste's eyes flick toward the greenhorn with an assessment that feels clinical. MacDonald maintains his usual silence, but his silence seems weighted with calculations you can guess at but can't confirm. Even Thomas himself seems aware of his status as the group's weakest link, his behaviour growing quieter and more anxious as the winter progresses. You're running mathematics in your head constantly now, calories remaining divided by days until spring, adjusted for the consumption patterns you've observed, extrapolated toward conclusions you don't want to reach. The numbers suggest that 4 men surviving through spring is possible but not certain. The numbers suggest that 3 men surviving would be significantly more likely. You've entered the territory of the unthinkable and you hate yourself for thinking it. The brigading tradition among mountain men evolved precisely to address these situations, though the tradition provides guidance rather than commands. A brigade shares resources and risks, but it also shares accountability. Every man carries his weight or explains why he cannot. Every man contributes or justifies his consumption. The system works because it's both communal and individual, balancing the benefits of cooperation against the reality that survival is ultimately personal. Thomas knows this. You watch him push himself beyond his physical limits, returning from hunting expeditions empty-handed but exhausted, throwing himself at the challenge of contribution with a desperation that's both admirable and insufficient. He's trying. There's no question about his effort. But trying doesn't fill the gaps in his skill set, doesn't transform his greenhorn limitations into veteran competence. Baptiste takes you aside one evening while Thomas and MacDonald are outside on some errand. His face carries an expression you haven't seen before, something between concern and pragmatism that makes your stomach tighten. "We must talk about the boy," Baptiste says, using the term boy to describe a man who's only a few years younger than you. The diminutive carries meaning you understand immediately. "I know," you say, because there's no point pretending you don't understand. He eats more than he provides. This is not accusation, it is mathematics. The winter is long. Our supplies are not infinite. What are you suggesting? Baptiste shrugs in his characteristically French way, a gesture that communicates volumes while committing to nothing. I suggest nothing. I observe. What we do with observations is a different question. The conversation ends there, incomplete and troubling. You return to the shelter and look at Thomas with new eyes, evaluating him as a resource rather than a companion. The evaluation makes you feel sick, but you do it anyway, because survival demands assessments that morality finds uncomfortable. The The brigading system includes provisions for dissolution, acknowledged methods by which partnerships can end and individual trappers can go their separate ways. The process is usually mutual, negotiated with whatever fairness circumstances permit. But the system also permits what might be called unilateral dissolution, situations where one party exits the arrangement without the other's consent. Mountain men don't talk about these situations directly. They describe them in oblique references, he went his own way, that could mean anything from voluntary departure to something darker. The ambiguity serves everyone, creating space for outcomes that nobody wants to examine too closely. You find yourself hoping for solutions that don't require you to make terrible decisions. Maybe Thomas will improve. Maybe the hunting will improve. Maybe the winter will prove shorter than expected, and all your dark calculations will become irrelevant. Maybe you'll look back on these thoughts with shame at how close you came to betraying the basic obligations of human community. The alternative is making choices you'll carry forever. MacDonald returns from wherever he disappeared to, and his expression suggests he's been thinking similar thoughts. You make eye contact, and some communication passes between you that requires no words. You're not alone in your calculations. MacDonald has been running the same mathematics, reaching the same uncomfortable conclusions. The question is whether you'll act on those conclusions, and if so, how and when. The shelter feels smaller than ever as night falls and the four of you arrange yourselves around the fire. Thomas moves with nervous energy that he's trying to suppress. Baptiste maintains his calm detachment. MacDonald watches the fire with an intensity that suggests he's seeing something none of the rest of you can perceive. You close your eyes and try not to think about tomorrow, or the next day, or all the days stretching towards spring that each carry the weight of decisions you don't want to make. Outside, the wind carries snow against your shelter walls with a sound like whispering. You can't quite make out what it's saying, and you're not sure you want to know. The Shoshone camp appears through the trees like a vision of possibility, smoke rising from lodges that look sturdy and permanent, and inhabited by people who seem to know secrets you desperately need to learn. You've made contact with this band before. They winter in this region most years, and your relationships with their people have been generally positive. But approaching any camp during a desperate winter carries risks that require careful navigation. You approach openly, walking toward the camp rather than skulking at its edges, demonstrating peaceful intentions through body language that you hope transcends linguistic barriers. A figure emerges from the nearest lodge to watch you. An elder woman whose weathered face carries an assessment that feels almost physically penetrating. She calls something in Shoshone that brings several men to investigate. The negotiation that follows involves your limited Shoshone, their limited English, and a great deal of gesture and demonstration. You're not here to beg. Mountain men and indigenous peoples maintain relationships of trade and mutual respect that preclude outright begging. You're here to learn, to trade knowledge and goods, to benefit from wisdom that your European heritage never provided. The Shoshone share information with a generosity that humbles you. They show you where to find game that you've overlooked, species and locations that your years in the mountains somehow failed to reveal. They demonstrate techniques for snow travel that reduce the energy you expend while increasing your range. They explain how to read winter weather in the texture of clouds and the behaviour of wind in ways that Baptiste's teachings only partially covered. The knowledge they share regarding cold weather shelter proves particularly valuable. Their lodges maintain warmth through engineering that your crude shelter only approximates. They've positioned their camp to take advantage of thermal features in the landscape, spots where the earth vents warmth or where reflection concentrates solar energy. They've developed clothing techniques using layered furs and strategic insulation that keep them comfortable in temperatures that leave you shivering. You absorb as much as you can, knowing that your ability to implement what you learn is limited by resources and time. The knowledge enters your consciousness like water into dry earth, filling gaps you didn't know existed, answering questions you didn't know to ask. Historians still argue whether mountain men's survival skills were primarily self-developed, or primarily borrowed from indigenous peoples. The answer seems obvious as you sit in this Shoshone lodge, receiving instruction with the humility of a student and the desperation of someone who understands that this knowledge might save his life. The food the Shoshone share represents more than calories. They give you dried meat from their own reserves, food they've prepared with techniques you don't fully understand, but that produce a product superior to your pemmican. The gift is generous. Food is finite for everyone this winter, and you accept it with awareness of the obligation it creates. Trading goods change hands as well. You offer steel knife blades, always valuable, and receive dried roots that provide nutrients missing from your meat-heavy diet. You offer tobacco and receive information about beaver locations that will prove valuable when spring finally allows trapping to resume. The exchanges follow protocols you've learned through years of interaction, neither party taking advantage, both parties benefiting according to their respective needs. The younger Shoshone men show curiosity about your rifles and your steel traps, technologies that still carry some novelty despite decades of fur trade interaction. You demonstrate carefully, aware that knowledge is the most dangerous export and that weapons technology has implications beyond simple hunting. They reciprocate by showing you bow techniques optimized for winter hunting, methods that make less noise than rifles, and don't require the powder and lead that your dwindling supplies can't spare. You spend 2 days in the Shoshone camp sleeping in a lodge that maintains warmth through methods your shelter can't match, eating food prepared with techniques your skills can't replicate. The experience is both educational and disheartening. Educational because you're learning so much, disheartening because the gap between their winter competence and yours seems vast and unbridgeable. When you leave, you carry more than physical supplies. You carry knowledge that will improve your odds, techniques that will reduce your suffering, and a renewed appreciation for the sophistication of peoples your culture has taught you to view as primitive. The word primitive seems absurd as you trudge back toward your crude shelter, your European education having proved far less useful than the accumulated wisdom of a people who've survived these winters for countless generations. Baptiste welcomes you back with questions about what you learned, and you share as much as you can remember. Some techniques are immediately implementable, adjustments to your clothing, modifications to your shelter that improve its thermal performance. Others require materials or skills you don't possess and will have to wait for future winters. Thomas listens with particular intensity, perhaps recognizing that improved collective knowledge improves his own position in the group's survival calculus. MacDonald asks no questions, but his attention suggests he's absorbing everything you describe. The visit has changed something in the group dynamic. You've returned with proof that survival is possible, that others are managing this winter with techniques that actually work. The information provides hope that was beginning to fade, evidence that spring is reachable if you can implement even a fraction of what you've learned. You start making modifications immediately, applying Shoshone insights to your own situation. The results are imperfect. You lack the materials and skills for full implementation, but even imperfect application produces improvement. Your shelter retains heat slightly better, your clothing keeps you slightly warmer, your hunting techniques yield slightly better results. In a winter where survival is measured in margins, slight improvements accumulate into significant advantages. You think about the Shoshone band continuing their winter in lodges that represent generations of refined knowledge, and you feel something between gratitude and envy. Gratitude for what they shared, envy for what they possess that you may never fully acquire. The mountains don't care about your feelings. They only care whether you survive. You get back to work. The temperature drops in early December to levels that your experience has not prepared you to comprehend. You wake one morning to find that the water in your shelter, water you kept near the fire specifically to prevent freezing, has turned solid overnight. The fire was burning. The water froze anyway. The mathematics of this situation refuse to resolve into anything comfortable. You step outside and immediately feel the cold attacking you from every direction simultaneously. This isn't the cold you've grown accustomed to, the manageable cold that retreats when you add layers and stay active. This is killing cold. Cold that finds the warm spots and murders them. Cold that penetrates protection like protection doesn't exist. Your breath freezes before it finishes leaving your mouth, creating crystals that hang in the air and catch the weak winter sunlight. Baptiste estimates the temperature at 40 below zero, maybe 50. The distinction matters less than the reality that temperatures in this range reduce survival margins to nearly nothing. Exposed skin freezes in minutes. Inadequate activity leads to hypothermia that progresses with terrifying speed. The human body becomes an enemy, bleeding heat into an environment that seems almost hungry for warmth. You learn to move differently in this cold. adopting techniques that conserve body heat while accomplishing necessary tasks. Every trip outside becomes a calculation of exposure time versus essential purpose. You develop rituals for leaving the shelter, checking and rechecking your clothing, ensuring every gap is sealed, planning your route to minimize time in the open. The horses suffer visibly. Patience stands with her head down, her body conserving energy, with the stubbornness of a creature that refuses to die, but can't quite figure out how to live. You've been feeding her cottonwood bark, the inner bark that provides minimal nutrition but keeps her alive, and her ribs have become visible through a winter coat that should be providing more protection than it seems to manage. MacDonald's horse dies 3 days into the cold snap. The animal simply lies down one evening and doesn't get up, its body heat bleeding away faster than its metabolism can replace it. MacDonald says nothing about the loss, but his expression carries a weight that you recognise as grief disguised as stoicism. The dead horse presents both tragedy and opportunity. MacDonald begins butchering the animal with efficient movements that suggest he's done this before, perhaps many times. The meat represents calories that will extend survival by weeks. The hide provides material for repairs and insulation. Even the bones have value, their marrow rich with fat that will prove precious in the hungry weeks ahead. You help with the butchering because refusing to help would be both impractical and cruel. The work is gruesome but necessary, and you focus on the mechanics rather than the emotions. A horse is an animal. Animals become food. This is how survival works in a world that cares nothing for sentiment. The cold snap persists for 8 days, and during that time you leave your shelter only for essential purposes, checking on the surviving horses, gathering firewood from the inadequate pile that you're burning through faster than any calculation projected, answering calls of nature that even the cold can't suppress. Each trip outside becomes an ordeal, a battle against an enemy that never tires and never retreats. You learn things about your body that you didn't want to know. You learn how frostbite begins as tingling and progresses to numbness that feels almost pleasant. You learn how the shivering that protects you can exhaust itself, leaving you in the calm warmth of hypothermia's final stage. You learn that the human will to survive can accomplish things that seem physically impossible, pushing through conditions that should be lethal through sheer, stubborn refusal to accept death. Baptiste tells stories during the long hours of shelter confinement, his voice providing texture in a world reduced to white and cold and waiting. He describes winters he survived in his decades of mountain life, catastrophes that seemed insurmountable until somehow they were surmounted. His stories carry a rhythm that feels almost therapeutic, the repetition of survival patterns that might work again because they worked before. Historians still argue whether the winter of 1836 represented a genuine climatic anomaly, or simply a particularly severe expression of normal variation. The distinction matters to scientists trying to understand historical weather patterns. It matters less to you, crouched in your shelter watching your breath freeze, waiting for temperatures to moderate enough to permit something resembling normal activity. The cold breaks on the 8th day with a shift in the wind that you feel more than hear. Temperatures rise to merely unbearable, and you emerge from your shelter like a creature being born into a new world. The landscape looks the same, white and frozen and hostile, but something has changed. The air has lost its killing edge. The sun provides warmth you can actually feel rather than merely see. You assess the damage from the cold snap with the grim practicality that winter demands. 1 horse dead. Firewood reserves depleted beyond comfortable margins. Physical condition of all brigade members degraded from days of confinement and insufficient activity. Morale damaged in ways that are hard to quantify, but easy to feel. But you're alive. All 4 of you are alive, which is more than can be said for trappers in other valleys who didn't prepare adequately or whose shelters proved insufficient or whose luck simply ran out. The sun rises higher than it has in weeks, casting shadows that remind you that time is passing even when it feels frozen. December is ending, January is coming, and you're still here to see it. The blackened toe stares up at you from the end of your foot like an accusation of inadequacy. You made a mistake 3 days ago, a stupid mistake, the kind of mistake greenhorns make, and now you're paying for it with flesh that died while still attached to your body. The mistake was simple, inadequate boot insulation during a longer than expected hunting expedition. You pushed too far from camp, stayed out too long, and by the time you returned the damage was done. Your right boot had accumulated moisture from sweat. The moisture had frozen, and your toe had frozen with it. You didn't even notice the progression. Frostbite announces itself through absence rather than pain. Numbness that feels like nothing until you see the colour change that reveals everything. The toe is black from the nail to the first joint. The skin hardened into something that doesn't feel like part of you anymore. It doesn't hurt, which is somehow worse than if it did. Pain would indicate living tissue capable of healing. The absence of pain indicates tissue that has passed beyond healing. Flesh that will never warm again no matter how close you hold it to the fire. You've seen this before on other men. Watched them deal with frostbite that claimed fingers and toes and ears and the tips of noses. Some of them ignored the problem, hoping dead tissue would somehow recover, and they learned that hope is not a medical treatment. Some of them cut away the dead flesh with the pragmatic efficiency that survival demands, accepting the loss of a body part in exchange for the retention of a body. Baptiste examines your foot with eyes that have seen this damage many times before. His diagnosis is quick and unsentimental. The toe is dead, infection will follow if it's not removed, and infection in these conditions will spread to living tissue and kill you. You know what must be done, he says. It's not a question. You know. You've known since you first saw the black colour spreading across flesh that used to be pink and warm and yours. The knowledge has been sitting in your mind like a stone, unavoidable and heavy. The procedure requires preparation that feels almost ceremonial. Baptiste heats your skinning knife until the blade glows dull red. Sterilization and cauterization tool combined into a single implement. MacDonald prepares clean cloth for bandages, torn from supplies that can barely spare the fabric. Thomas watches with horrified fascination, his greenhorn imagination probably adding details worse than the reality. You drink whiskey, not enough to impair your judgment, but enough to dull the edge of what's coming. The whiskey burns going down and spreads warmth through your body that feels almost obscene given what you're about to do to that body. Baptiste offers to perform the amputation, and you consider accepting. He has more experience, steadier hands, better technique. But something in you insists on doing this yourself, on maintaining agency even in the reduction of your own flesh. The toe is yours. If it has to be removed, you'll be the one to remove it. The knife enters the joint with a sensation that your mind struggles to process. There's pressure, but no pain. The nerve endings are as dead as the tissue they used to serve. You cut carefully, following the natural separation between bones, and you feel the moment when the toe separates from your foot, with a finality that makes you gasp despite the absence of physical pain. The cauterization that follows produces the only real agony. The heated blade presses against living flesh at the wound's edge, sealing blood vessels and creating a barrier against infection. You hear yourself make sounds you didn't know you could make, and you feel Baptiste's hands holding your leg steady while MacDonald presses a leather strap into your mouth to prevent you from biting through your tongue. The pain passes, or perhaps you simply pass through the pain, arriving on the other side in a state of trembling exhaustion that feels almost peaceful. The wound is sealed, ugly but functional, a price paid for a mistake that you'll never make again. Baptiste bandages the foot with practiced efficiency, wrapping clean cloth around the stump with care that seems almost tender, given the violence of what just occurred. He says nothing about the procedure, offers no words of comfort or condemnation. The deed is done. What matters now is healing. You spend the next week confined to the shelter, your foot elevated to prevent swelling, your body fighting to repair damage that will leave you permanently diminished. The brigade adjusts around your incapacity. MacDonald takes over duties you would have performed. Baptiste manages the hunting that keeps everyone fed. Thomas proves surprisingly useful during your recovery, bringing water and food and clean bandages with a diligence that seems like his way of proving value to the group. Historians still argue whether mountain men's cavalier attitude toward injury reflected genuine toughness, or simply necessity disguised as bravado. Lying in your shelter, watching your bandaged foot and contemplating the toe you've lost, you suspect the answer is both. You're tough enough to cut away part of yourself and keep functioning. But you're also trapped in circumstances that permit no other response. Softness dies in these mountains, only hardness survives. The wound heals slowly, forming scar tissue that pulls and aches when weather changes. You'll feel this injury for the rest of your life, however long that proves to be. Every step will remind you of the mistake you made and the price you paid. But you're alive, missing a toe, weakened by the procedure, but alive. The winter continues around you, indifferent to your suffering, patient for more opportunities to claim pieces of you that it hasn't taken yet. You hope there won't be more opportunities. But hope and the mountains have a complicated relationship. Patience stands in the snow with her head down, too weak to raise it, too stubborn to fall. You've been watching her decline for weeks, watching her ribs emerge through her winter coat, watching her legs tremble when she tries to move. The cottonwood bark you've been feeding her isn't enough. It was never going to be enough. And now you're facing a decision that mountain men make every winter, but that never gets easier. The horse has been your companion for 4 years, carrying you through terrain that would have killed you on foot, bearing your weight and your equipment with patient endurance that earned her the ironic name you gave her. She saved your life during the October blizzard, providing warmth and windbreak when nothing else would have served. She's carried you to hunting grounds and back, borne the weight of elk carcasses that would have been impossible to transport otherwise, and now you're considering eating her. The calculation is brutally simple. A horse provides several hundred pounds of meat, enough calories to sustain your brigade for weeks. A dead horse provides those calories. A dying horse will provide them soon, regardless of your decision. The only question is whether you take action now, while the meat is relatively fresh and the animal is relatively intact, or whether you wait for natural death and accept the losses that waiting will impose. Baptiste watches you watching patience, and his face carries the expression of a man who has been where you are and knows what you're thinking. He offers no advice. This decision belongs to you alone, but his presence provides a kind of silent support that you appreciate more than you'd admit. MacDonald has already made this decision once this winter, converting his own horse into supplies that have helped sustain the brigade through weeks that might have been impossible otherwise. He understands the mathematics, the practical necessity, the cold equations of survival. His experience provides precedent but not comfort. Thomas doesn't understand. His greenhorn sensibilities revolt against the idea of eating a creature that has been a partner rather than prey. He argues for waiting, for hoping, for alternatives that don't exist. His arguments are emotionally compelling and practically useless, and you listen to them with patience that surprises you before explaining why they can't guide your decision. You approach Patience as the sun sets behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow. She doesn't react to your approach. She's too weak, or too trusting, or some combination that makes what you're about to do feel even worse. You run your hand along her flank, feeling the bones beneath the fur, and you remember all the miles you've travelled together. "I'm sorry," you say, though you're not sure if you're apologising to the horse or to yourself. The rifle shot echoes off the canyon walls with a finality that seems to resonate long after the sound has actually faded. Patience drops immediately, the bullet through her brain providing the quickest end you could offer. She doesn't suffer. That much at least you can claim. The butchering takes hours, bloody work that you perform with mechanical efficiency, because allowing yourself to feel would make it impossible. You separate meat from bone with practiced cuts, learning the anatomy of a horse through the same process you've used on elk and deer and buffalo. The body that carried you becomes components: muscle for eating, fat for rendering, hide for leather, bones for tools, and marrow. Baptiste helps without being asked, his presence transforming the task from solitary horror into shared necessity. His hands are steady where yours shake, his movements efficient where yours falter. He's done this before, probably many times, and his experience guides you through moments when you might otherwise stop. By full dark, the work is largely complete. The meat is cut into portions that will freeze in the cold and remain preserved until you need them. The hide is stretched for later processing. The bones are set aside for the marrow extraction that will provide crucial fat calories. The parts of the horse that you can't use are left for wolves and ravens, offerings to scavengers who will appreciate what you cannot. You return to your shelter and sit near the fire without speaking. The others give you space, understanding that something has happened that requires processing before it becomes bearable. Thomas's face carries judgment that he's trying to suppress. Baptiste's face carries nothing but acceptance. MacDonald has already retreated into whatever interior world he inhabits during difficult moments. Historians still argue whether mountain men's willingness to eat their horses represented practical adaptation or moral collapse. The distinction matters less than you thought it would, now that you've made the choice yourself. Survival demanded action. You took action. The horse is dead. and you will live because of it. The guilt settles into you like cold settling into your shelter. Gradually, pervasively, impossible to entirely eliminate. You know you made the right choice. You also know that right is a word that carries different meanings in different contexts, and that the context of survival permits choices that would be monstrous in any other setting. You dream of patience that night, dreaming of rides through mountain meadows in sunlight that seems impossibly warm. In the dream, she's strong and healthy and trusting, carrying you toward destinations that recede as you approach. You wake in darkness with tears frozen on your face and the fire burning low. The meat from your horse will sustain you through weeks to come, but something else has been consumed as well, some part of yourself that you'll never get back. This is what the mountains take from you, not just toes and horses and companions, something less visible but equally essential. You add wood to the fire and wait for dawn. The world has turned white in every direction, a uniformity so complete that your eyes ache from the effort of finding contrast. Snow blindness crept up on you gradually over the past few days. A headache you attributed to other causes, sensitivity to light that seemed like ordinary squinting, and then the burning that announced the real problem. Your eyes have been sunburned by light reflecting off endless snow, and now you're paying the price. The pain is constant and varied, shifting between stabbing sharpness and dull ache in patterns you can't predict. Tears stream down your face continuously, your eyes' desperate attempt to heal damage they didn't know how to prevent. Light, any light, even the dim glow from your shelter's fire, creates agony that makes you want to close your eyes forever. You've wrapped a strip of cloth around your eyes, creating darkness that provides relief while also creating helplessness. You can't see to hunt, can't see to work, can't see to contribute anything meaningful to the brigade's survival efforts. You've become a burden, consuming resources without replacing them, taking up space that might be better used by someone who can actually function. The experience of blindness, even temporary blindness, reconfigures your relationship with the world in ways you didn't anticipate. Your hearing becomes hypersensitive, passing sounds that you normally filter out into meaningful information. Footsteps in snow carry identity. Baptiste walks with a particular rhythm. MacDonald moves silently except when he wants to be heard. Thomas's nervous energy translates into distinctive patterns of motion. Your sense of smell sharpens similarly, distinguishing wood smoke from fat smoke, identifying who enters the shelter by the particular odour of their clothing. The world shrinks to what you can perceive through non-visual channels, and you discover that those channels carry more information than you ever appreciated. Time distorts without visual cues to anchor it. You lose track of whether it's day or night, morning or evening, your internal clock drifting without the light patterns that normally calibrate it. You sleep in fragments, waking confused and disoriented, uncertain how long you've been unconscious or what's happened while you were. Baptiste tends to your condition with the practical competence he brings to every problem. He brews tea from plants he gathered before winter, medicines you didn't know he possessed, remedies from traditions you don't fully understand. He applies compresses of warm water and herbal mixtures to your eyes, providing temporary relief that allows you to rest. The Shoshone knowledge Baptiste incorporates into your treatment includes techniques you've never encountered. He explains that mountain peoples have dealt with snow blindness for generations, developing methods that work even without access to European medicine. The knowledge was shared with him decades ago by a healer he describes with respect that transcends cultural boundaries. Historians still argue whether indigenous medicine represented genuine efficacy or simply placebo effect, a debate that seems absurd as Baptiste's treatments gradually reduce your pain and begin restoring your vision. The plants work, the compresses work, the knowledge works. Academic debates about mechanism seem irrelevant when results speak for themselves. The blindness lasts 4 days before you can remove the cloth and tolerate light without immediate agony. Your vision returns gradually. Blurry at first, colours washed out and contrasts reduced, but functional. The world that swims into view carries new beauty that you didn't perceive before you lost the ability to see it. You learn from the experience. Baptiste constructs eye protection for you, a strip of leather with narrow slits that admit enough light to see, while blocking the reflected glare that caused your injury. The device looks absurd, but you wear it religiously on every outdoor expedition, understanding now that your eyes are as vulnerable as any other body part and require protection accordingly. The other brigade members adopt similar protection after watching your suffering. Thomas fashions his own version from materials he scrounges. MacDonald produces eye protection that he apparently already possessed, explaining nothing about why he had it or why he didn't wear it himself. The experience becomes a lesson for everyone, survival wisdom purchased with your pain. The landscape remains white and reflective and dangerous, but you navigate it now with new awareness. You keep your protected eyes moving, never staring too long at any bright surface, never allowing the accumulated damage that leads to blindness. The caution feels excessive until you remember 4 days of agony and helplessness, and then it feels entirely appropriate. You've added another item to the catalogue of ways the mountains can kill you, a way you never considered before but won't underestimate again. The list grows longer with every week of winter, each new threat adding to your understanding of how narrow the path between survival and death really is. Your vision clears fully by the end of the week, colours returning to their proper intensity, contrasts sharpening to normal levels. The world looks more beautiful than it did before the blindness, or perhaps you're simply more grateful to see it. Either way, you can see again. And seeing, you can survive. January's cold has a particular quality that distinguishes it from the cold of earlier months, a weight and persistence that suggests it intends to stay forever. The sun rises later and sets earlier than seems possible, compressing daylight into a few precious hours that vanish before you can accomplish anything meaningful. The darkness that brackets each day seems hungry, pressing against your shelter walls with intentions you don't want to imagine. Your food supplies have reached the point where denial becomes impossible. The pemmican caches that seemed generous in autumn now reveal their limitations, depleted faster than projected by a winter worse than anticipated. You're rationing with mathematical precision, but the mathematics keep producing answers you don't want to accept. You've begun supplementing your diet with sources you would have considered beneath notice in better times. The inner bark of cottonwood trees, the same material you've been feeding to horses, provides minimal calories but some nutritional value. You peel it from trees with numb fingers, chewing the bitter substance with determination rather than appetite. Baptiste introduces you to techniques for extracting nutrition from unlikely sources. Certain lichens become edible after proper processing, though the processing requires time and care you can barely spare. Pine needles can be steeped for tea that prevents the scurvy you've seen claim other trappers in other winters. The knowledge seems like magic until you realise it's simply accumulated wisdom from people who learned through suffering what the mountains demand. The starvation that edges closer each day has distinctive symptoms you're learning to recognise. The constant cold that normal food intake would prevent. The mental fog that makes simple decisions feel impossible. The weakness that transforms routine tasks into exhausting ordeals. You're not starving yet, not truly, but you're travelling in that direction with a momentum that frightens you. Thomas suggests eating leather, boot tops, straps, harness pieces that have no other use. You've heard of this. Read accounts of desperate men who consumed their own equipment when nothing else remained. The suggestion seems extreme until Baptiste nods in agreement, confirming that leather provides genuine calories if properly prepared. The preparation involves boiling leather for hours until it becomes soft enough to chew and digest. The process produces a substance that looks like wet boot and tastes exactly like you'd expect wet boot to taste. But it provides something: calories, nutrition, the psychological benefit of eating rather than not eating. And in January of the deadliest winter you've experienced, something is better than nothing. You establish new rationing protocols that reduce each person's daily intake to levels that would be considered starvation in any other context. The protocols create arguments that the group can barely afford. Thomas complaining that Baptiste receives larger portions, MacDonald observing that Thomas contributes less than he consumes, everyone's temper fraying under the pressure of insufficient food. You moderate the arguments with authority you didn't realise you possessed, establishing rules that everyone accepts even if no one likes them. Equal portions regardless of contribution, a decision that penalises the productive to protect the vulnerable. The decision feels unjust to part of you, but the alternative is watching Thomas starve while the rest of you eat, and that feels worse. The hunting continues despite conditions that make hunting nearly impossible. You push through snow that reaches your chest, covering territory that becomes harder to travel each day, searching for game that seems to have vanished completely from the landscape. Most expeditions return empty-handed. A few produce small game, rabbits, the occasional winter-thin deer, that extend your supplies by days rather than weeks. Historians still argue whether mountain men in these conditions experience genuine starvation or merely severe food restriction. The distinction matters to scientists studying historical nutrition. It matters less when your stomach cramps continuously and your body begins consuming its own muscle tissue for energy. The moon that rises over the mountains in late January is what some indigenous peoples call the starvation moon, a name that captures perfectly the essence of this time of year. The name implies experience, generations of people facing the same conditions you face, finding names for suffering that becomes familiar through repetition. You look at that moon through snow-laden trees and you understand why it earned that name. The cold light illuminates a landscape stripped of abundance. A world where survival requires consuming everything available and hoping it's enough. You're not sure it's enough. The mathematics keep producing ugly answers, and you're running out of variables to adjust. But the moon will set and the sun will rise, later and shorter than you'd like, but it will rise, and another day will present another opportunity. Maybe tomorrow you'll find game. Maybe tomorrow something will change. Hope is irrational in conditions like these, but hope persists anyway, stubborn as the cold itself. The stories arrive in fragments, whispered references that stop when you get too close, conversations that shift to other topics when outsiders approach. But fragments accumulate into patterns, and patterns eventually become clear enough to understand even if they're never stated directly. Some trappers, the stories suggest, survived the early months of this winter through methods that the speakers don't describe explicitly. Some brigades emerge from January with members suspiciously missing and explanations that don't quite hold together. Some camps contain supplies that couldn't have come from hunting, protein sources that nobody's willing to identify. The word cannibalism is never spoken aloud. Mountain men don't discuss such things directly. The taboo is too strong, the implications too disturbing. But the word hovers in silences and hangs in conversations that end too abruptly, a presence that everyone senses and nobody acknowledges. You think about the mathematics that drove you to cut away your own toe, to eat your own horse, to consume leather and bark and lichen in the search for calories. You think about where those mathematics lead when pushed far enough, when all other options have been exhausted, when survival demands choices that no human should ever face. You tell yourself you'll never make such choices. You tell yourself there are lines that survival cannot cross, boundaries that remain fixed regardless of circumstances. You tell yourself that death would be preferable to certain forms of living. But you also remember how easily you crossed other lines you once considered absolute. You remember how the unthinkable becomes thinkable when you're hungry enough, and cold enough, and desperate enough. You remember that survival has a logic of its own, a logic that laughs at the moral certainties you constructed in the comfort of civilization. Baptiste shares a story one evening, speaking carefully and watching your reactions. The story concerns a brigade he encountered decades ago, men who emerged from a terrible winter with haunted eyes and answers that didn't match the questions. He never learned the truth of what happened to them, but he learned enough to form suspicions he's never quite been able to dismiss. The mountains test everyone, Baptiste says. Some tests are about strength, some are about skill, some are about what you're willing to do when nothing else will save you. You understand what he's not saying. You understand the question he's asking without asking. I don't know, you admit. I don't know what I'd do. Baptiste nods, accepting the honest answer. No one knows. Not until the moment comes. Historians still argue whether the documented cases of winter cannibalism among mountain men represent rare extremities, or merely the visible tip of an iceberg whose true size remains hidden by the silence of survivors. The question matters academically, but doesn't change the reality you're facing. Your brigade is not at that point. You're hungry, you're weak, you're burning through supplies faster than you can replace them. But you still have options. Hunting that might succeed tomorrow, caches you haven't fully depleted, sources of marginal nutrition that you haven't fully exhausted. The final resort remains theoretical, a hypothetical you hope never becomes real. Thomas asks about the stories one night, his greenhorn curiosity overcoming the discretion that the topic demands. You tell him to stop asking, to stop thinking about it, to focus on the work of survival that doesn't require contemplating the unthinkable. He nods, but you see in his eyes that the question has lodged there, taking up residence alongside all the other questions that this winter has planted. MacDonald, as usual, says nothing about any of it. His silence on this topic mirrors his silence on every topic, giving away nothing about his thoughts or memories, or the experiences that might inform his views. You wonder sometimes what MacDonald has witnessed in his years in the mountains, what he knows that he never shares. The February moon rises over a landscape that seems to have forgotten that any season except winter ever existed. The cold has become permanent, a fundamental feature of reality rather than a temporary condition. You've stopped thinking about spring as a real possibility, stopped imagining warmth as something you might experience again. The world is frozen, and you are frozen in it, and that's simply how things are. But somewhere beneath the frozen surface, the sun is moving toward the equator. Somewhere in the future, warmth is waiting. Somewhere, spring exists, whether or not you can imagine it. You just have to survive long enough to reach it, and hope that surviving doesn't require becoming something you can't live with afterward. The wolf appears at the edge of the tree line as you're checking your rabbit snares, a grey shadow that doesn't move when you look directly at it. You've seen wolves before, they're common enough in these mountains, but this one is different. This one is watching you with an attention that feels almost personal. The wolf is thin, winter gaunt, its ribs visible through fur that should be hiding them. It's hungry, you realise, as hungry as you are. The winter that's tested your brigade has tested every creature in these mountains, and the wolves have been losing the contest as surely as the humans. You reach for your rifle, moving slowly, trying not to provoke attack while preparing for defence. The wolf watches your movement without reacting, its yellow eyes following your hands with an intelligence that seems almost human. It's calculating, you understand, measuring risk against reward, assessing whether you represent danger or opportunity. More wolves appear from the trees, 3, then 5, then 7 grey shapes that arrange themselves in a loose semicircle that cuts off your retreat toward camp. They move with coordinated purpose, positioning themselves with a tactical sophistication that suggests this is not accidental. They're hunting you. Your rifle is loaded, but 7 wolves are more targets than you can engage before the survivors reach you. Your knife is at your belt, but a knife against a wolf pack seems optimistic at best. Your options are narrowing with every moment the wolves hold their position, their patience outlasting your planning. You back toward a large tree, putting solid wood behind you, eliminating at least one direction of attack. The wolves adjust their positions, maintaining the semicircle, their coordination almost beautiful in its efficiency. They've done this before, hunted prey that fights back, and they know how to handle resistance. The standoff extends for what feels like hours but is probably minutes. Neither you nor the wolves move to attack. You're both calculating, both waiting, both searching for the moment of advantage that will tip the balance. The cold continues to press against you, reminding you that waiting has limits, that eventually you'll have to act or freeze. You shoot the lead wolf without really deciding to, the rifle rising and firing in a motion that seems to bypass conscious thought. The animal drops, and the sound of the shot rolls across the valley like thunder. The other wolves scatter, not retreating entirely, but breaking their formation, giving you space to move. You run toward camp, reloading as you move with hands that fumble from cold and adrenaline. Behind you, you can hear the wolves regrouping, their initial panic fading as they realize you've only killed one of them. They begin following, not attacking but not retreating either, maintaining a distance that allows them to react to whatever you do next. You reach camp with the wolves still trailing, close enough to see but not close enough to engage. Baptiste emerges from the shelter with his own rifle, adding another threat that the wolves must consider. Thomas appears with a burning branch from the fire, waving it at the tree line with frantic energy that probably helps less than he thinks. The wolves hold their position through the afternoon, a grey presence at the edge of visibility that reminds you that you're not the only predator in this landscape. They're waiting for opportunity, a moment of weakness, a failure of vigilance, a mistake they can exploit. Night falls with the wolves still watching, their eyes catching firelight in glints that seem almost supernatural. You organise watches that keep someone awake at all times, feeding the fire to maximum brightness, creating a perimeter of light that the wolves won't cross without significant provocation. The siege continues for 3 days before the wolves finally withdraw, driven away by hunger that forces them to seek easier prey elsewhere. You find the body of the wolf you shot, frozen solid and gnawed by its packmates, a testament to how desperate even the predators have become. Historians still argue whether wolf attacks on humans were common in the historical West, or whether the stories were exaggerated by frontier mythology. Living through this siege, the academic question seems irrelevant. The wolves were real, their hunger was real, their tactical intelligence was real. Whether or not such events were statistically common, this event happened to you. You add wolf defense to the list of skills you're developing, survival wisdom purchased through experience you'd rather not have earned. The wolves will return eventually, hunger will drive them back, and you'll need to be ready when they do. The winter continues, indifferent to your conflicts with wildlife, patient for more opportunities to test your adaptation. The trapper who stumbles into your camp in mid-February looks like death requesting a meeting. His clothes hang from a frame that seems to have lost a third of its original mass. His face is a mask of frozen beard and blistered skin. His eyes carry the emptiness of someone who has already died and not yet noticed. His name is Harris, you learn, a trapper you vaguely remember from Rendezvous, a quiet man who kept to himself and attracted little attention. He travelled with a brigade of 3 others, wintering in a valley perhaps 20 miles north of your position. He's the only survivor. The story emerges in fragments over the days that follow, as Harris recovers enough to speak coherently. His brigade made preparation errors that compounded through the winter, inadequate shelter and insufficient supplies, and bad decisions that snowballed into disaster. 2 men died in January from exposure and starvation. The third man, Harris's closest companion, died 2 weeks ago from causes Harris doesn't describe clearly, and you don't push him to clarify. Harris walked south through conditions that should have killed him, guided by some combination of survival instinct and pure luck. He found your camp by following the smoke from your fire, the only evidence of human presence in a landscape that seemed otherwise empty of life. You take him in because refusing would be murder, because the traditions of mountain hospitality demand assistance to travellers in need, because you can't look at another human being suffering and choose to increase that suffering. The decision is immediate and unanimous. Even the mathematics of survival that have made your conversation so brutal don't extend to abandoning a dying man at your door. But the decision creates complications that you'll be navigating for weeks. Harris represents another mouth to feed from supplies that were already inadequate. He represents another person to shelter in a space that was already crowded. He represents a disruption to the equilibrium your brigade has achieved, an unknown element in a system that was barely stable. The trading that follows represents survival capitalism in its purest form. Harris has nothing, literally nothing, except the clothes on his body and the rifle he somehow managed to keep through his journey. But nothing today doesn't mean nothing forever. He can offer future payment, promises of labour and goods when conditions improve, IOUs that mountain tradition treats as seriously as physical currency. You negotiate carefully, aware that you're bargaining with a man who has no real options and who therefore cannot truly negotiate freely. The ethics are uncomfortable, but the alternative is worse. You need something in exchange for the resources you're providing, something that makes the sharing feel like trade rather than charity. Mountain men can accept trade. Charity corrodes something essential in a culture built on self-reliance. Baptiste facilitates the negotiation with experience that makes you grateful for his presence. He understands the protocols, the unwritten rules, the careful dance that allows everyone to maintain dignity while acknowledging brutal reality. He helps Harris understand what's possible, and helps you understand what's fair. The agreement you reach gives Harris membership in your brigade for the remainder of the winter, with obligations that extend into the spring and summer. He'll contribute labour when he recovers enough to work. He'll share any pelts he takes during spring trapping. He'll remember this assistance and reciprocate when circumstances allow. Historians still argue whether mountain men's informal trading systems represented genuine economies or merely cultural rituals that allowed exchange to occur. Living through these negotiations, the distinction seems unimportant. The trades work. They transfer resources from those who have to those who need, while maintaining the social structures that make cooperation possible. Whether that qualifies as economy, by academic standards, matters less than whether it keeps people alive. Harris sleeps for nearly 2 days straight after the negotiations conclude, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. It had been fighting since he left his camp. When he wakes, he's weak but coherent, damaged but healing, a survivor who has added his story to the growing catalogue of winter horrors that you're all accumulating. He tells you about the conditions he witnessed, the dead he buried, the choices he made. His stories are grim, and some of them contain silences that suggest worse grimness unspoken. You don't push for details. Everyone carries burdens from this winter that don't require sharing to be real. The brigade is 5 now instead of 4, and the mathematics have adjusted accordingly. Food shares are smaller, space is tighter, complications have increased. But you're also stronger in a way. More hands for work when Harris recovers. More knowledge from someone who's survived different conditions. More connection to the larger community of trappers scattered across these mountains, all of them fighting the same battle against the same enemy. The winter continues outside, indifferent to your negotiations and your new arrangements. The warmth arrives in late February like a cruel joke, temperatures rising into ranges that almost feel comfortable after the months of brutal cold. You emerge from your shelter and feel sunlight on your face that carries actual heat rather than mere brightness. The snow begins to soften, losing the crystalline hardness that has characterized it all winter, becoming something almost malleable. For a few glorious days you allow yourself to hope. Spring is coming early. The worst is over. The survival that seemed so uncertain is now assured. You expand your activities, taking advantage of the improved conditions to hunt more effectively, to gather more firewood, to accomplish tasks that the deep cold made impossible. Then the flooding begins. The false thaw melts just enough snow to create water that has nowhere to go. The streams that have been frozen solid for months begin to break up, ice jams forming and releasing in patterns that create unpredictable surges. Your camp, positioned near a creek for water access, suddenly finds itself in the path of water that rises with terrifying speed. You evacuate essential supplies to higher ground, moving with frantic urgency as the water continues to rise. The shelter you built with such care, the structure that has protected you through months of killing cold, takes water damage that might compromise its integrity. Your firewood, carefully stacked and protected, gets soaked to levels that make it nearly useless. The flooding lasts 3 days before the water begins to recede, and during those 3 days you lose more supplies than you've lost in any single disaster since the winter began. Food that got wet and froze and became inedible. Equipment that rusted or rotted, or simply disappeared in the flow. Progress that you'd made towards spring, erased by a thaw that came too early and caused more harm than the cold it briefly replaced. Then the temperature drops again, and the false thaw reveals itself as precisely that, false. The brief warming was not a herald of spring, but a cruel interruption, a pause in winter that served only to weaken your position before the cold resumed. The frozen streams refreeze, trapping debris at random locations. The snow that had softened hardens into ice that's far more difficult to travel through than the powder it replaced. Your shelter requires repair that tests your remaining resources. The water damage has compromised insulation, created gaps that let cold penetrate. You patch and reinforce with materials you can barely spare, rebuilding defences that you hoped were already adequate. The psychological damage of the false thaw proves almost worse than the physical damage. You had allowed yourself to hope, to imagine an end to the suffering that's defined your existence for months. The hope proved unfounded, and its failure leaves a residue of despair that's harder to shake than any previous setback. Baptiste maintains his characteristic steadiness, treating the setback as merely another challenge to be addressed, rather than evidence of cosmic malevolence. His resilience provides an anchor that keeps the rest of you from drifting into complete hopelessness. The mountains always test hope, he says. Real hope survives the testing. Harris, the survivor you rescued in February, provides unexpected perspective. At least we're all still here, he observes. At least we have shelter to repair. At least we have each other. His words carry weight because he's experienced losses that make your setbacks seem manageable. He knows what it means to have nothing, and he appreciates having anything. Historians still argue whether the winter of 1836 was unusual in its false thaws, or whether such events were common features of Rocky Mountain winters that simply didn't make it into the historical record. The academic question matters less than the practical reality of rebuilding your camp while trying not to despair. The work of recovery fills the remainder of February and the early days of March. You rebuild, reinforce, restock whatever supplies you can manage to gather. The cold that followed the thaw gradually moderates, not the dramatic warming of spring, but a gradual lessening of intensity that suggests the worst might actually be passing. You begin watching for signs of spring with renewed attention, wary now of false hope but unable to suppress hope entirely. The sun rises earlier each day, setting later. The angle of light changes in ways that carry promise. The snow begins to settle, compacting under its own weight in patterns that suggest gradual melting rather than sudden flooding. Real spring is coming. You're not sure when, but you're increasingly confident that it's coming. The question is whether you can survive long enough to see it. You've survived everything the winter has thrown at you so far. You've survived cold and hunger and isolation and injury and predation and false hope. You've lost pieces of yourself, physical and psychological, but the essential core remains. A few more weeks, maybe a month. Surely you can survive that long. The prayer that MacDonald speaks one evening catches everyone by surprise, including, you suspect, MacDonald himself. His voice rises in words that mix Christianity and something older, a hybrid spirituality that reflects the complex cultural background he's never fully explained. The prayer isn't long, but it fills the shelter with an energy that feels different from anything you've experienced all winter. You've never been particularly religious. The mountains have a way of eroding certainties that seemed solid in civilization, but you find yourself listening with attention that approaches reverence. MacDonald is asking for survival, for spring, for the strength to endure whatever remains of this winter. The request seems reasonable, even urgent, regardless of what entity might be receiving it. Baptiste crosses himself when MacDonald finishes, the gesture automatic and somehow touching in a man whose pragmatism usually overshadows any spiritual dimension. Thomas murmurs an amen that might be sincere or might be social obligation. You can't tell. Harris says nothing, but his eyes are closed in an expression that could be prayer, or could simply be exhaustion. You don't pray yourself, not exactly, but you find yourself feeling something that might be gratitude. Gratitude that you're alive, that you're not alone, that even in this brutal winter, humans retain the capacity for reaching towards something beyond mere survival. The feeling doesn't solve any of your problems, but it provides a resource you didn't know you needed. The spiritual practices that emerge in your shelter over the following weeks represent the strangest hybrid you can imagine. MacDonald's prayers continue, varying in content but consistent in their mixture of traditions. Baptiste produces a rosary from somewhere in his possessions, working the beads with fingers that move through long memorized patterns. Thomas finds comfort in scripture verses he recalls from a childhood that seems impossibly distant. You contribute nothing explicitly religious, but you find yourself developing rituals that serve similar purposes. The careful maintenance of your rifle becomes almost meditative, a practice of attention that quiets the mind. The nightly check of supplies becomes a form of inventory prayer, counting blessings even as you count calories. The morning emergence from the shelter becomes something like a sunrise greeting, acknowledgement of another day survived. Historians still argue whether mountain men were genuinely religious, or whether their apparent faith was cultural habit that didn't survive serious examination. Living through this winter, the distinction seems less clear than you might have expected. Whatever you call what's happening in your shelter, religion, spirituality, psychological coping mechanism, it's providing something that pure rationality cannot. It's providing hope. The Shoshone band that winters nearby offers a different perspective on spiritual practice when you visit them in early March. Their rituals are embedded in daily life in ways that make the Christianity of your upbringing seem compartmentalized by comparison. Everything is connected to everything else, hunting and prayer and healing and weather and the well-being of the community. The separation between sacred and secular that defines European religion simply doesn't exist. You watch a healing ceremony performed for a sick elder, drumming and chanting and the burning of herbs that fill the lodge with aromatic smoke. You don't understand the words or the theology, but you understand the intention, community gathering around someone who needs support, collective energy directed toward a desired outcome. The mechanism might be supernatural, or it might be psychological, but the effects are real. The elder improves over the following days, whether through spiritual intervention or natural healing or the power of being cared for. Superstition creeps in around the edges of whatever faith your brigade maintains. You develop personal taboos that make no rational sense but that you follow anyway. Rituals around how you load your rifle, specific orders in which you put on your clothing, words you won't speak because speaking them might invoke bad luck. The superstitions are embarrassing to admit but impossible to abandon, providing a sense of control in circumstances that permit very little actual control. Deadliest has the most elaborate superstition structure, accumulated over decades of mountain life. He won't trap on certain days, won't eat certain animals, won't mention certain topics during certain conditions. His taboos seem arbitrary until you realise they emerge from experience, situations where breaking the taboo preceded disaster, patterns that might be coincidence but that feel too consistent to dismiss. The winter of 1836 has tested everything. Bodies, skills, supplies, relationships. Now it tests faith, whatever form that faith might take. The mountains don't care what you believe, but belief seems to help anyway, providing resilience that pure materialism can't explain. You add another log to the fire and watch it burn, finding meaning in the flames that you couldn't articulate if someone asked. The meaning might be real or might be projection, but the distinction matters less than the comfort the meaning provides. Spring is coming. Faith helps you believe that, and believing, you survive. The robin appears on a bare branch in early March, so unexpected that you initially mistake it for an optical illusion. Your starving mind projecting wishes onto the frozen landscape. But the robin remains after you blink, after you shake your head, after you walk closer to investigate. It's real. A small bird with a red breast that shouldn't be here yet, that should still be wherever robins spend their winters, that represents a promise you barely dare to accept. The robin is lying. You know this intellectually, understanding that early bird arrivals often precede weather disasters that kill the pioneers and make the caution of later arrivals seem wise. But the robin is also telling the truth. Something is changing in the world. Some shift in conditions that prompted the bird to move north earlier than safety requires. The change might be temporary, another false thaw that will retreat into cold, or it might be real, the first genuine signal that winter is loosening its grip. You watch the bird until it flies away, carrying your hopes with it into a sky that looks slightly less grey than it has for months. The sighting becomes a story you tell the others when you return to camp, a small piece of good news in a winter that has offered very little good news. Their reactions range from Baptiste's cautious acknowledgement to Thomas's excited celebration to MacDonald's characteristic silence. Other signs accumulate over the following days, small changes that might mean nothing individually, but that collectively suggest transformation. The creek begins to open at its edges, unfreezing inch by inch in a process so gradual that you can't see it happening but can measure it over days. The snow settles and compresses, losing inches of depth without any obvious melting. The sun's path across the sky shifts towards something that feels almost like warmth. You find yourself studying the landscape with the intensity of someone reading scripture, searching for messages about your future in the arrangement of snow and ice and bare branches. The messages you find might be real, or might be wishful thinking. You can't tell, and the uncertainty adds to the anxiety that the approaching spring creates rather than relieves. Because spring is dangerous. The knowledge sits in your mind alongside the hope, reminding you that many trappers die during the transition between seasons rather than during the depths of winter itself. The ice that was safe to walk on becomes treacherous. The rivers that were frozen solid become torrents that sweep away the unwary. The warmth that feels like salvation creates conditions, avalanches, flooding, sudden storms, that kill as effectively as the cold. You begin planning for spring travel with awareness that the planning itself is dangerous, tempting you toward premature action that could prove fatal. The trails you'll need to traverse are currently impassable, buried under snow that will take weeks to melt sufficiently for safe travel. The rivers you'll need to cross are currently somewhere between frozen solid and completely open, the most dangerous phase of their annual cycle. The conditions you're anticipating don't exist yet, and acting as if they do could kill you. Baptiste counsels patience with the weight of experience behind his advice. Every year, he says, men die because they couldn't wait. The mountains don't hurry. Neither should we. But patience is harder now than it was in the depths of winter. During the coldest months, you had nothing to wait for except the abstract possibility of survival. Now, you're waiting for something specific. The opening of trails, the clearing of conditions, the moment when you can finally leave this valley and rejoin whatever remains of the world beyond it. The specificity makes the waiting almost unbearable. Historians still argue whether the spring of 1836 was unusual in its gradualness, or whether all Rocky Mountain springs proceed with the same agonizing slowness. Living through this particular spring, you understand why the historical record might be unclear. People experiencing this kind of anticipation don't maintain careful records of conditions. They maintain sanity barely, and that's all they have energy for. The game that returns with the warming conditions presents a temptation you can barely resist. Elk begin appearing in the valley, moving north from their winter ranges, and the sight of them triggers hunting instincts that have been frustrated for months. You want to shoot every elk you see, to stockpile meat that will ensure your survival through whatever challenges spring presents. But overhunting now could compromise the elk population for years to come, destroying the resource you depend on for a short-term gain that might not even be necessary. You force yourself to hunt sustainably, taking only what you need and leaving the rest for the future. The discipline is painful, but it's the right choice. The signs continue accumulating. More birds, more meltwater, more warmth in the sun's angle, and your certainty grows despite your determination to remain cautious. Spring is coming. Winter is ending. You've survived. The knowledge settles into you slowly, disbelief fighting against evidence, hope struggling against the caution that months of disaster have taught. But eventually the knowledge becomes real, becomes something you can accept and plan around. You're going to make it. The morning you break winter camp carries a weight that you don't know how to name. Relief tangled with grief, hope mixed with exhaustion, survival shadowed by the awareness of everything survival cost. You move through the familiar space with the strange detachment of someone leaving a home they never wanted and can never forget. Your shelter still stands, though it shows the damage of months of habitation and several near disasters. The walls you built with such care in autumn have settled and shifted, gaps appearing that the winter's repairs only partially addressed. The fire pit is cold now, will stay cold, will eventually become indistinguishable from the surrounding earth as nature reclaims what you temporarily borrowed. The packing takes hours, though you have less to pack than you started with. Your trapping gear is worn but functional. You'll use it through the spring season, gathering pelts that will justify this winter's suffering with economic returns. Your supplies are depleted but not exhausted. Enough food for the journey to the rendezvous, enough ammunition to hunt along the way, enough equipment to function as a trapper rather than merely a survivor. Your brigade gathers for the departure with a quiet solemnity of people who share experiences that words can't adequately describe. Baptiste's weathered face carries satisfaction that looks almost like peace. Thomas has aged years in months, the greenhorn softness replaced by something harder and more capable. MacDonald remains MacDonald, silent and competent, his interior life as mysterious as ever. Harris, the survivor you rescued in February, joins the group with gratitude that shows in his every movement. The counting of survivors becomes inevitable as you prepare to leave, mental arithmetic that produces numbers you've avoided calculating until now. Your brigade started as 4 and ends as 5. You've gained rather than lost, a remarkable outcome that you attribute more to luck than skill. But other brigades weren't so fortunate. You've heard of losses, deaths, disappearances that won't be explained until the rendezvous assembles and the missing are counted. The journey out of the mountains proceeds with caution that the landscape demands. The trails are passable now mostly, but they carry dangers that the trails of autumn never presented. Snow bridges that might or might not support your weight. Stream crossings through water that's shockingly cold despite the warming air. Slopes that threaten avalanche with every step. Accumulations waiting to release with catastrophic force. You travel slowly, covering perhaps half the distance you'd cover in easier conditions, and you accept the slowness as the price of safety. Every man lost to spring accidents represents a waste of everything the winter required, months of suffering squandered by a moment of impatience. You've invested too much to lose the investment now. The landscape around you transforms as you descend, winter giving way to spring with increasing speed as you move toward lower elevations. The snow that seemed permanent in the high valleys becomes intermittent, then scattered, then absent entirely except in shaded spots that cling to winter against the evidence of the calendar. Green appears, tentative at first, then increasingly confident, as grass and leaves respond to warmth that finally feels real. You pass the remains of other winter camps, abandoned shelters that tell stories you can sometimes interpret. This camp looks orderly, deliberately vacated by survivors who had time to pack properly. That camp looks abandoned in haste, suggesting disaster that forced sudden departure. One camp, which you examine with the morbid curiosity of survivors, shows signs of death. Frozen blood, scattered supplies, the absence of human remains that might mean burial or might mean something worse. You don't count the dead you can identify, not yet. That counting will happen at the Rendezvous, when the scattered survivors gather and the absences become impossible to ignore. For now, you focus on your own survival, your own journey, the trail immediately ahead rather than the community devastation you're beginning to sense. Historians still argue whether the winter of 1836 was the deadliest on record for Rocky Mountain trappers, or whether the historical record is too incomplete for such claims. Living through it, you suspect the academic question will remain unresolved. Too many deaths went unwitnessed. Too many survivors never shared their stories. Too much was lost in ways that left no trace for historians to discover. The final miles before reaching lower elevation pass in a blur of exhaustion and emerging hope. You've been moving on reserves you didn't know you possessed, fueled by determination that becomes less necessary as safety becomes more certain. The warm wind that rises from the plains below feels like blessing, like promise, like proof that the world beyond winter still exists. You stop at an overlook that provides a view of the territory ahead. Rolling hills, emerging green, a landscape that seems almost impossibly benign after the mountains you've left behind. The view is beautiful in a way that stabs at something in your chest. Beauty that you're finally able to perceive because you're finally certain you'll live to appreciate it. Your brigade gathers around you, 5 men who started the winter as 4, survivors of something that should have been unsurvivable. Nobody speaks because speaking would require words equal to the occasion, and no such words exist. The mountains rise behind you, white-capped and indifferent, keeping the secrets of the winter you somehow endured. Ahead lies the rendezvous, reunion, the return to something resembling normal life. You take a breath that fills your lungs with spring air, and you begin walking toward whatever comes next. The rendezvous at Horse Creek in the summer of 1837 assembles slowly, survivors trickling in from valleys and ranges across the Rocky Mountains. Each new arrival becomes a small celebration or a large grief, depending on whether the face is expected or the absence is confirmed. You watch the community reform, counting heads with the grim arithmetic of aftermath. The numbers are bad. Everyone knows the numbers are bad even before anyone tries to calculate them precisely. The winter of 1836 took more trappers than any winter in memory, more than the Blackfoot conflicts of the early years, more than any epidemic or disaster in the fur trade's brief history. The absences speak louder than any announcement, empty spaces where familiar faces should appear. You share your story with those who ask, condensing months of suffering into anecdotes that seem inadequate to the experience. The toe you lost, the horse you ate, the cold snap that froze water near the fire, the wolves that besieged your camp, the survivor you rescued who still trails behind you, still paying off the debt that saved his life. Others share their stories, and you listen with the understanding of someone who can truly comprehend what they describe. Tales of starvation that went further than yours, tales of cold that exceeded even what you experienced, tales of loss that make your sacrifices seem modest by comparison. The fur trade itself seems to have changed through the winter, though the changes take time to recognize. Fewer trappers mean less competition for beaver, which should be good news, but fewer trappers also mean less community, less support, less of the social fabric that makes this lifestyle bearable. The men who survived are harder than they were, more cautious, less inclined toward the optimistic risk-taking that characterized the trade in earlier years. Baptiste, you learn, is considering retirement. The winter that you survived together pushed him toward a decision he'd been avoiding for years. The mountains have taken enough from him, and he's not willing to give them any more. He's talking about returning to Montreal, to whatever remains of the life he left decades ago. to a warmth that doesn't have to be fought for constantly. The knowledge that Baptiste will leave carries weight that surprises you. He's been your teacher, your anchor, your connection to traditions that might otherwise have died with the men who practiced them. His departure will leave a gap that no one else can fill. Thomas, against all reasonable expectation, has decided to continue trapping. The winter that nearly killed him has transformed him from greenhorn to veteran, from liability to asset, from someone who consumed more than he contributed to someone who can hold his own. His improvement represents one of the winter's few unambiguously positive outcomes. MacDonald remains MacDonald. No announced plans, no explanations, no clues about what his future holds. He'll appear at next year's rendezvous or he won't, and either way he won't explain his reasoning to anyone who asks. Harris stays close to you, still working off the obligations he incurred during his rescue. His skills have improved through the spring trapping season, and his debts are shrinking toward manageable levels. By next rendezvous he'll be free of obligation, able to make his own choices without reference to the winter that almost killed him. You think about what this winter taught you, lessons that you'll carry forward into whatever comes next. You learned that preparation matters less than adaptation, that the best laid plans dissolve when conditions exceed anything you planned for. You learned that community provides resources that individuals cannot generate alone, that 4 men together have better odds than 4 men separately. You learned that survival extracts costs that don't appear in any ledger, pieces of yourself that you'll never get back, experiences that you'll never forget. Historians still argue whether the winter of 1836 represented a turning point for the Rocky Mountain fur trade, or merely an exceptionally severe expression of challenges that the trade always faced. Living through it, you suspect the answer is both. The trade was already changing, beaver prices declining, silk hats replacing felt, the economic foundations crumbling beneath the cultural superstructure. The winter accelerated changes that were already underway, pushing the trade toward an end that might have come anyway, faster or slower. You'll trap again next winter, probably. The skills you've developed remain valuable, the lifestyle still appeals despite its costs, and you don't know how to do anything else. But you'll trap differently, more cautiously, with better preparation, with awareness of what the mountains can become when they decide to test everything you thought you knew. The rendezvous continues around you, trade goods changing hands, stories being told, the annual ritual that defines mountain man existence proceeding as if the winter hadn't happened. But the winter did happen, and everyone here carries it with them, visible in the spaces where friends should be standing and invisible in the scars that clothing and composure conceal. The summer sun beats down with warmth that still feels miraculous after months of killing cold. You close your eyes and feel it on your face, this warmth that you nearly died without experiencing again. You survived the deadliest winter of 1836. The achievement feels smaller than it should, diminished by awareness of everyone who didn't survive, everyone whose luck or skill or preparation proved insufficient against conditions that exceeded all preparation. But you survived. And surviving, you continue. The mountains wait in the distance, patient as always, already beginning to gather the weather that will define next winter. You'll return to them eventually because you can't imagine not returning, because the mountains have become part of who you are regardless of how much they cost you. But for now, for this moment, you're warm and alive and surrounded by the community of survivors who understand exactly what that means. It's enough. For now, it's enough. And so you let the warmth settle deeper into your bones, let the soft evening light of the rendezvous fade into something gentler, something that asks nothing of you but rest. The stories are told, the counting is complete, and the night arrives with its usual patience. Not the predatory darkness of mountain winter, but the kind darkness of summer, velvet and welcoming and warm. Your body remembers the cold, will remember it always, the way the mountains have written themselves into your flesh and your memory. But your body also remembers how to rest, how to release the vigilance that survival demanded, how to soften into the simple pleasure of being alive without having to fight for it moment by moment. The stars appear above the rendezvous, the same stars that watched over your frozen shelter, the same ancient light that has witnessed every winter and every spring since before humans walked these mountains. They're beautiful tonight. They were always beautiful, even when you were too focused on survival to notice. Now you can notice. Now you have the luxury of beauty. Your breathing slows, following the rhythm of a world that has stopped demanding everything from you. The voices of other trappers fade to murmurs. The campfires become warm glows at the edge of perception, and the distance between waking and sleeping narrows to something you can cross without effort. You made it. Through the worst winter anyone remembers, you made it. The achievement doesn't require celebration. The survival itself is enough. The simple continuation of breath and heartbeat, and the gradual gathering of rest. Let your eyes grow heavy now. Let the tension in your muscles release like snow melting in the spring sun. Let the memories of cold fade into the warmth that surrounds you, that has always been waiting for you, that welcomes you now into the peace you've earned. Sleep, survivor. The mountains will be there tomorrow and the day after, and for all the tomorrows you have remaining. But tonight, there's only rest. Only rest. Only the gentle darkness of a summer night, and the quiet certainty that you are safe, and the slow drift into dreams that carry no danger. Sweet dreams.